I'd driven through Navajo country dozens of times working the oil fields near Farmington, but I'd never lingered long enough to absorb much beyond the scenery. My younger brother Raymond had never even been this far north. We'd planned a road trip from Santa Fe, pushing northwest through Arizona's Four Corners and into Monument Valley, hoping to snap pictures of Shiprock Peak at sunrise. Raymond, who fancied himself a photographer, insisted that golden hour at Shiprock was worth skipping a motel stay for. I'd reluctantly agreed, thinking the drive would be smooth enough. Around midnight, we turned off the main highway, heading north on Navajo Route 33 through Cove Chapter, aiming for a shortcut Raymond had found through Red Valley. I felt good about the route. I'd vaguely remembered driving parts of it before during a supply run back in 2017, but the optimism faded quickly. The road stretched endlessly before us, unmarked and increasingly rough. Potholes appeared without warning in our headlight beams, forcing me to swerve suddenly. The truck's suspension groaned with each jolt. Raymond sat beside me, camera equipment carefully stowed in the back seat, studying the route on his phone before the signal finally died completely. He'd been excited earlier, talking endlessly about aperture settings and exposure times, but now he'd grown quiet, watching the darkness swallow the landscape around us. About an hour past Cove, just as we passed Sawmill Trail, I noticed the temperature gauge needle jump suddenly into the red. The dashboard light glowed ominously, casting an orange reflection across the windshield. "Julian, something's wrong," Raymond said, leaning forward anxiously, his voice tight with concern. "I see it," I muttered, pulling the truck onto the shoulder. There was a sandstone bluff overlooking a wide valley, lit dimly by a thin crescent moon. The visibility was poor, shapes barely distinguishable from shadows. I killed the engine immediately, letting the truck roll to a stop on the gravel shoulder. Stepping out into the biting winter air, we popped the hood, letting steam spill upward into the darkness. The smell of hot metal and coolant filled my nostrils. I shone my flashlight down into the engine compartment and saw what I had feared. The radiator was almost empty, fluid pooled beneath the truck, staining the sand dark. My stomach sank. We had water in the back, but pouring it into a hot engine risked cracking the radiator block, leaving us stranded for good. We had no choice but to wait until morning and let things cool off naturally. Raymond rubbed his gloved hands together and shook his head, breath forming vapor clouds in the frigid air. "Perfect timing. At least we have blankets and snacks," I said, trying to sound reassuring, though my own confidence was wavering. The temperature had to be in the low 20s, maybe colder. Wind cut through the valley with a sharpness that stung exposed skin. Raymond was clearly uncomfortable, glancing nervously toward the dark ridgelines that surrounded us on three sides. The landscape felt oppressive in its emptiness, vast and indifferent. There was no cell service, of course, not way out here. The nearest town was probably 30 miles in any direction. We settled back into the truck cab, trying to find comfortable positions, preparing ourselves mentally to endure a cold, restless night. I pulled a heavy wool blanket from behind the seat and draped it across both of us. Raymond curled against the passenger door, arms folded tightly, breath visible in the cold air despite the insulation. Raymond drifted off after about half an hour, his breathing becoming slow and rhythmic. I tried to follow suit, but found myself restless, staring through the windshield into the darkness. The moon provided barely enough light to outline the nearest rock formations. Everything beyond 30 feet dissolved into blackness. My mind wandered, thinking about the work I'd left behind, the deliveries scheduled for next week, wondering if my supervisor would understand the delay. The oil fields operated on strict timelines. Missing a delivery meant lost contracts, lost income. But there was nothing to be done about it now. It was around 2 in the morning when I first heard the sound, a deep, low howl carrying far across the valley. I knew coyotes well enough from my years working these lands. This wasn't a coyote. This was longer, lower, almost human in its tonal quality, but raw and animalistic at the same time. The sound seemed to wrap around the truck, coming from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The hairs on my neck prickled instantly, and I nudged Raymond awake, perhaps more forcefully than necessary. "You hear that?" He sat up slowly, eyes unfocused and bleary. "Hear what?" As if answering, the howl came again, closer this time and from the opposite ridge. The sound was clearer now, more distinct. There was something wrong about it. something that triggered an instinctive alarm deep in my primitive brain. Raymond stiffened instantly, staring into the darkness, suddenly fully awake. "What is that?" he whispered. "No idea," I said, trying to mask my unease. "Maybe an elk or something." Even as I spoke, I knew it was a lie. I'd heard elk bugling during hunting season. This was nothing like that. Raymond shook his head, his eyes locked forward, hands gripping his knees. "I've never heard an elk sound like that." We sat frozen for several long minutes, listening intently. The wind had died completely, leaving an eerie stillness that amplified every small sound: the creak of the truck settling, the faint whistle of air through a gap in the door seal, our own breathing. Against my better judgment, we stepped out of the truck again, straining our eyes in the dim moonlight. The valley stretched ahead of us, dark and silent now. The howls had faded into echoes that seemed to hang in the air like smoke. My boots crunched softly on the gravel, each step sounding impossibly loud. Just as we turned to get back into the truck, Raymond grabbed my arm, pointing wordlessly at the sandstone ridge across the road. His grip was tight, fingers digging into my jacket sleeve. I followed his gaze, squinting into the darkness. My heart began hammering violently. Standing on the top of the outcrop was a tall figure, backlit by moonlight, a dark silhouette hunched and elongated. It looked oddly twisted, limbs longer than seemed possible, its stance almost predatory. The proportions were all wrong. The torso was too narrow, the legs too long, bent at angles that didn't match human anatomy. The thing was silent, completely still, like a statue carved from the darkness itself. We watched, frozen ourselves, unwilling or unable to move. My rational mind screamed explanations: a tree, a rock formation, shadows playing tricks. But my instincts knew better. This was alive. This was watching us. Then it tilted its head back slowly, deliberately, and let out a howl identical to the ones we'd just heard. The sound was deafeningly loud, unmistakably animal, yet disturbingly human in its undertones. It carried pain and hunger in equal measure. Raymond took a step backward, breathing hard. "Julian." I slowly reached into the truck, opening the center console with trembling fingers and gripping the revolver I'd stashed there, a .357 Magnum I'd carried for years while working remote sites. My fingers shook as I loaded rounds into the chamber, the metallic click seeming impossibly loud. I never took my eyes off the figure on the ridge. We both stood perfectly still, as if locked in some silent standoff. My heart hammered in my chest, every muscle tensed and ready to bolt. Sweat formed on my palms despite the cold. The figure remained motionless, and for a brief moment I wondered if we were staring at nothing, if fear had conjured something from shadows and moonlight. Then, without warning, the thing began to descend from the ridge. It moved strangely, its limbs jerking as if unsure how to carry its own weight. Something in its movement seemed almost bird-like, awkward in its precision, yet terrifyingly deliberate. Each step was calculated, careful, like a predator approaching prey. "Get back in the truck," I whispered sharply, barely able to force the words through my constricted throat. Raymond obeyed immediately, scrambling inside with frantic movements, but I held my ground, raising the revolver with both hands, trying to steady my aim. The weapon felt heavy, inadequate against whatever was approaching. The creature paused about 50 yards away, and under the faint glow of moonlight, I saw its head clearly for the first time, elongated, snout-like, with eyes that reflected in the dark like an animal's. Its mouth was slightly open, revealing what appeared to be sharp, irregular teeth. The facial structure was wrong, caught somewhere between canine and human, belonging fully to neither. Then it dropped to all fours. I expected it to charge at us, to rush forward in a final, terrifying assault. But instead, impossibly, it began crawling swiftly backward up the slope, its grotesque form moving with unnatural speed. The movement defied logic, defied physics, its joints bent in ways that shouldn't have been possible, limbs extending and contracting fluidly. Within seconds, it vanished behind a large boulder near the ridge top. I stumbled backward, nearly falling as I climbed into the truck. My legs felt weak, unreliable. We sat wordlessly in shock, doors locked, breathing raggedly as we stared out into the silent darkness. I kept the revolver clenched in my sweaty palm, knowing that rest wouldn't come again until dawn. The digital clock on the dashboard read 2:47 a.m. Sunrise was still hours away. For the next hour, neither of us said a word. We sat in stunned silence, breath fogging the windows, eyes locked on the sandstone bluff. The truck cab felt cramped, suffocating despite the cold. My palm was sweaty around the revolver grip, finger resting nervously along the trigger guard. Raymond shivered next to me, fists clenched tightly in his lap, knuckles white. I tried convincing myself we'd imagined it, that fear and exhaustion had warped reality into something monstrous. But every time I closed my eyes, the image was clear, its long limbs bending at unnatural angles, its head tilted back, howling into the night sky. The sound still echoed clearly in my memory, impossible to dismiss or rationalize away. "Julian, what the hell was that thing?" Raymond finally broke the silence, his voice barely audible above the thrum of adrenaline in my ears. "I don't know," I whispered back, eyes still fixed ahead on the darkness. "Let's just stay quiet." He nodded, leaning forward slightly, eyes scanning the darkness outside with frantic intensity. The moon had shifted position, offering barely enough light to outline shapes beyond the truck. Shadows stretched long and distorted across the sand, shifting with every passing cloud. The landscape seemed alive, moving, threatening. Minutes dragged on endlessly. My eyes burned from staring unblinkingly at the same vista, afraid to even blink in case something approached during that fraction of a second. My neck ached from the tension, muscles locked tight. Then Raymond stiffened suddenly, his back pressed hard against the seat. "It's back," he breathed. I leaned forward, squinting into the gloom, scanning the ridgeline where we'd first seen the figure. At first, nothing seemed different, just the same desolate landscape of rock and brush, painted in shades of black and gray. But as my eyes adjusted, focusing on the middle distance, I saw movement near the base of the ridge. It stood upright now, frozen in place, staring directly toward us. Even from this distance, I could feel the weight of its gaze, could sense the intelligence behind those reflecting eyes. My heart slammed violently in my chest, pulse roaring in my ears. Without warning, the creature began descending again, this time more rapidly. It moved with that same bizarre gait, knees turning inward, stepping forward in jerky, halting motions that looked painful. Its limbs swung awkwardly, too long for its body, like a puppet with strings pulled by an amateur handler. Each stride felt unnatural, disconnected, like it was trying to imitate something human but failing horribly. "It's coming this way." Raymond's voice trembled, panic seeping through every syllable. I gripped the revolver tighter, swallowing hard against the dryness in my throat. Stay calm. But calm felt impossible. My entire body screamed at me to run, to start the engine and flee regardless of the consequences to the radiator. Only the knowledge that we might not make it a mile before breaking down completely kept me frozen in place. The figure dropped onto all fours again, head still locked forward in our direction, and began crawling fast, disturbingly fluid but backward. The speed was shocking, covering ground impossibly quickly, like watching a film play in reverse at double speed. Raymond's breath hitched sharply beside me. "Oh God, oh God." I fumbled for the flashlight in the center console, desperate to see clearly, to understand what we were facing. My fingers closed around the metal cylinder and I yanked it free, snapping it on and aiming the bright beam straight toward the approaching form. It froze instantly, bathed in the harsh white glare. My stomach twisted violently. The creature stood slowly, rising to its full height in the flashlight beam. It was taller than I'd guessed, nearly 7 feet, maybe more. Its long limbs hung loosely from its gaunt frame, covered unevenly with patches of dark fur that looked matted and filthy. In places, bare skin stretched tight over visible ribs, pale gray under the beam of light, almost translucent. But worst of all was its head, elongated, canine-like, but with a flattened face that suggested something more than simple animal. The eyes reflected back a sickly yellow glow, unblinking, fixed on us with an intensity that felt almost personal. Its jaw was partially open, revealing rows of sharp, irregular teeth that looked designed for tearing flesh. "Shoot it," Raymond shouted frantically, his voice cracking with terror. I raised the revolver skyward with shaking hands and squeezed the trigger. The sharp crack of the gunshot reverberated across the valley, echoing off distant canyon walls. The muzzle flash illuminated everything for a split second. The creature, the rocks, Raymond's terrified face beside me. The creature recoiled sharply at the sound, its head jerking backward as if struck. For a moment I thought I'd hit it, but no, it was reacting to the noise itself, to the sudden violence of the sound in the silent night. Then, without hesitation, it dropped once more to all fours. With a speed I'd never imagined possible, it bolted sideways, moving perpendicular to us, disappearing instantly behind a cluster of rocks 30 yards to our left. The movement was fluid, predatory, efficient. My hands shook uncontrollably. I glanced at Raymond, whose eyes were wide, pupils dilated with pure terror, his face drained of color even in the dim light. Neither of us moved or spoke. We barely breathed. The revolver felt inadequate now, small and useless against whatever was out there. 6 rounds, that's all I had, and I'd just wasted one firing into empty air. For another long stretch of silence, we waited, too frightened to even shift position. I kept the flashlight pointed toward where the creature had vanished, but saw nothing, just rock and shadow and empty space. Then, from behind us, a faint scratching noise started. Metallic, scraping gently along the truck bed. The sound was deliberate, methodical, like fingers dragging across steel. Julian Raymond hissed softly, his voice barely a whisper. "I hear it," I answered through clenched teeth, glancing into the rearview mirror. Nothing showed in the limited view, but the sound continued, a careful, deliberate scraping along the metal surface. My nerves felt raw, exposed. Every instinct screamed at me not to leave the truck, not to expose myself, but I couldn't sit here blind, not knowing what was happening behind us. Slowly, cautiously, I cracked open the driver's door, flashlight in one hand, revolver in the other. The cold air rushed in immediately. My pulse hammered painfully in my ears, so loud I was certain anything outside could hear it. Stepping out, I shined the beam toward the back of the truck, heart lodged in my throat, finger tight on the trigger. The bed was empty. No marks, no footprints, no animal or shape retreating into the darkness. Only sand and rock, quiet and still. The tailgate was latched, undisturbed. I stood there for a long moment, scanning the surrounding area with the flashlight, trying to understand what I'd heard. The wind had picked up slightly, perhaps enough to move something loose in the bed. But I knew that wasn't it. The sound had been too deliberate, too consistent. I climbed back inside, locking the doors firmly behind me. Neither of us relaxed. Raymond stared forward blankly, arms folded tightly across his chest, breathing shallow and rapid. "What's happening?" he finally asked, his voice small and lost. "I don't know," I admitted quietly. "I honestly don't know." By 4:30, the world beyond the windshield felt lifeless, suspended in that peculiar darkness that exists in the hours before dawn. The moon had set, leaving only starlight, thousands of points of light that did nothing to illuminate the ground. I'd kept the flashlight on for a while, sweeping it periodically across the landscape, but the battery was dying and I needed to conserve it. We sat in near total darkness now, relying on what little our eyes could gather from the stars above. Then I caught movement again on the ridge ahead, not the same location as before, but further east, closer to where the road curved around the bluff. This time it wasn't just one figure. It was several. Shadows crouched low, perched silently along the sandstone rim like gargoyles on a cathedral. I counted at least 4, maybe 5 distinct shapes, spaced evenly along the ridge. They didn't advance, didn't howl, didn't move at all. They just waited, unmoving, eyes reflecting dully in the thin starlight. My throat constricted. Raymond let out a long, shaky breath beside me. "They're watching us," he whispered numbly. "I know," I murmured back, dread settling heavy inside me like a physical weight. "We just have to make it to sunrise." The figures remained perfectly still, maintaining their positions like sentries. I couldn't tell if they were the same creature we'd seen earlier or different ones. The distance and darkness made it impossible to distinguish details, but the posture was similar, too tall, too angular, wrong in fundamental ways. Minutes passed like hours. I kept glancing at the dashboard clock, willing it to move faster. 4:52, 5:03. Raymond had closed his eyes at some point, though I knew he wasn't sleeping. His breathing was too irregular, too controlled. He was simply trying to retreat somewhere inside himself, somewhere safer than this truck surrounded by things that shouldn't exist. Around 5:15, one of the figures on the ridge stood slowly, rising to its full height. Even at this distance, the movement was unmistakable, fluid, and disturbing. It turned its head slowly, scanning the valley, then dropped back down to its crouch. They were communicating somehow, coordinating. The realization sent ice through my veins. I'd dealt with predators before: mountain lions, bears, even a pack of feral dogs once. But those were animals, operating on instinct and hunger. This felt different. This felt intelligent, purposeful. "Julian," Raymond said quietly, eyes still closed. "If we don't make it..." "Don't." I cut him off sharply. "Don't talk like that. We're going to be fine." He opened his eyes, looking at me directly for the first time in over an hour. "You don't believe that?" He was right. I didn't. But saying it aloud would make it real, would give the fear permission to consume us completely. "Dawn is coming," I said instead, more to convince myself than him. "Whatever they are, they'll leave when the sun rises."
How do you know?
I didn't answer, because I didn't know. It was nothing more than desperate hope, a prayer to any god who might be listening. When the first faint glow of sunrise began to seep over the horizon, it felt as if the weight pressing on my chest finally loosened. The sky transformed slowly from black to deep purple, then to shades of pink and orange that painted the canyon walls with color. Raymond was still rigid beside me, gripping his knees as if bracing for another nightmare to emerge. Neither of us had managed even a moment of real rest after seeing those things watching silently from the ridgeline. In the pale dawn, everything around us slowly transformed. The jagged cliffs softened into shades of red and gold, the dark brush brightening into greens and browns, the landscape becoming more familiar, less threatening, normal. I scanned the ridgeline anxiously, searching for the figures we'd seen throughout the night. The outcrop was empty now, nothing but rock and sparse vegetation. They'd vanished sometime in the last hour, retreating to wherever they'd come from. I forced myself out of the truck, legs stiff and shaky from hours of immobility. My breath fogged in the morning chill as I moved cautiously toward the hood, revolver still firmly in hand. The weight of it had become familiar, comforting even. Raymond followed, nervously scanning the hills as I lifted the hood and peered inside. The radiator had cooled down enough now, steam no longer rising from the components. With careful, slow movements, I began pouring water from our reserve into the reservoir. It trickled and gurgled quietly, steam rising slightly, but no longer violently hissing like before. I breathed a small sigh of relief. "Think it'll hold?" Raymond asked, voice low and cautious, eyes never leaving the surrounding landscape. "It better," I muttered, tightening the cap carefully. "We're not staying here any longer." Just as I twisted the radiator cap shut, the quiet hum of tires on pavement approached from the distance, startling both of us. We turned quickly, shielding our eyes against the glare of morning sun, and watched as a white utility truck slowed and pulled up on the roadside behind us. An older Navajo man climbed out, dressed in worn coveralls with a weathered face that showed years of working outdoors. His expression was calm, unreadable as he moved toward us. He glanced briefly at the revolver I was still gripping, but made no comment. "Trouble with your vehicle?" he asked plainly, his voice carrying the distinctive accent of the region. Embarrassed, I tucked the weapon into my waistband. "Overheated," I answered cautiously, studying his face for any reaction. "Think it'll be okay now." The man nodded thoughtfully, his eyes calmly scanning the valley beyond us, taking in the landscape with the familiarity of someone who'd traveled these roads countless times. Without further comment, he walked back to his truck, pulled a large plastic jug from behind the seat, and returned to hand it to me. "Here, drink some water." We drank gratefully, the water cold and sharp, helping to clear the fog of exhaustion and fear. The simple act of drinking, of performing something normal and human, helped ground us back in reality. The man watched patiently as we finished, never once questioning why two young men looked so pale and shaken in the early morning chill. His eyes were kind but knowing, as if he understood more than he was saying. Finally, he gestured vaguely toward the canyon walls and the sandstone ridges that stretched across the horizon. He spoke softly but clearly, choosing his words with care. "You boys should head out now," he advised gently. "Things move between those canyons when the moon is thin. Best not to linger." His tone carried certainty, not superstition. He'd lived here, knew these lands and their secrets better than we ever could. There was no judgment in his voice, only pragmatic warning. Raymond and I exchanged a glance, both knowing it was time to leave. No explanations, no questions. The man's warning had been clear enough, and we had no desire to test its accuracy. "Thank you," I managed, returning the water jug. He accepted it with a slight nod. "Drive safe, stay on the main roads." We climbed back into our truck, movements mechanical, operating on autopilot. As I turned the key, the engine rumbled smoothly to life, bringing instant relief that washed over me like warm water. The sound was beautiful, normal, reliable, everything the night had not been. Without looking back, I guided us carefully onto the road, headed toward US Route 191. Neither of us spoke as we drove south, shadows gradually shrinking under the climbing sun. In the rearview mirror, I watched the sandstone bluffs recede into the distance, becoming smaller and less threatening with each passing mile. The Navajo man's truck remained parked on the shoulder, a white speck against the red landscape. I wondered how long he'd stay there, if he was waiting for something, or simply making sure we actually left. At the junction leading toward Shiprock, Raymond pointed hesitantly ahead. "Should we still try for the photos?" he asked, voice weak, almost uncertain. "No," I said firmly, not even considering it. "We're going west through Montezuma Creek. We're leaving Arizona behind." He nodded quietly, visibly relieved, leaning back against his seat, closing his eyes briefly for the first time since the night began. The tension in his shoulders began to ease slightly as the miles accumulated between us and Red Valley. The landscape gradually changed as we drove, becoming more populated, more civilized. Gas stations appeared, then small houses, then actual towns with traffic lights and convenience stores. The normal world reasserted itself, making the events of the night feel increasingly surreal, dreamlike. We stopped for gas in Bluff around 8:30 a.m. Raymond pumped while I went inside to pay and grab coffee. The fluorescent lights were harsh after the darkness, the aisles filled with ordinary things, candy bars, magazines, motor oil. A middle-aged woman worked the register, barely glancing at us as she processed the transaction. Everything was aggressively normal, almost offensively so, after what we'd experienced. Back in the truck, we continued west through the Utah desert. Raymond finally spoke around 10 a.m., breaking hours of silence. "Julian, what do we tell people?" I'd been thinking about the same question, turning it over in my mind repeatedly. "Nothing," I said finally. "We tell them nothing." "But who would believe us?" I interrupted. "Who could we tell this to without sounding completely insane?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the passing landscape. "So we just, can you?" I asked honestly. "No," he admitted quietly. "I don't think I ever will." By the time we crossed into Utah proper, the sun was bright overhead, the landscape empty and open under clear blue skies. Even in the broad daylight, the memories from the darkness clung stubbornly, refusing to fade. Every time I closed my eyes, even for a moment, I saw that figure on the ridge, heard that howl echoing across the valley. We drove straight through to Santa Fe, stopping only for gas and food. The truck ran fine, the radiator holding steady, as if the breakdown had never happened. By the time we pulled into my driveway around 8 p.m., we'd been awake for nearly 40 hours straight. Raymond gathered his camera equipment still unused, the photos never taken, and headed to his car without much ceremony. We'd barely spoken for the last 100 miles, both lost in our own thoughts. "Raymond," I called as he opened his car door. He turned, looking exhausted, years older than he had 2 days ago. "We don't talk about this," I said firmly. "Not to anyone, not ever." He nodded slowly. "Yeah, okay." A few days later, back home in Santa Fe, I found myself sitting on the front porch, staring numbly into space, the phone loosely in my hand. All the planned sightseeing, photographs, and stories we'd meant to gather had vanished, replaced by the uneasy weight of something we couldn't explain, something that still lingered at the edge of our consciousness. The planned family dinner to share our photos and stories had been quietly canceled. Raymond had called in sick to work for 3 days straight. I'd returned to the oil fields, but found myself distracted, jumping at shadows, finishing my routes earlier than necessary to avoid being caught out after dark. My phone buzzed sharply, startling me from my thoughts. It was Raymond. A simple, short text appeared on my screen. "Did you tell anyone?" I hesitated only briefly, then typed back a quick response. "No. Let's never go back there." His reply came almost immediately. Agreed. I tossed the phone onto the table beside me, leaning back in my chair. Above, the sun was warm, the air calm and clear. Neighbors walked past on the sidewalk. Kids rode bikes. A dog barked somewhere down the street. Life continued exactly as it had before, indifferent to what Raymond and I had witnessed in Red Valley. Yet somewhere deep inside, the howl still echoed, distant but unmistakable, rising slowly like a forgotten memory that refused to fade away. I knew with absolute certainty that I would hear that sound for the rest of my life, in quiet moments, in darkness, in the space between waking and sleeping. Whatever we'd encountered in those canyons, it had marked us somehow, changed us in ways I was only beginning to understand. The world felt different now, larger and more dangerous, filled with things that existed just beyond the edge of firelight and human understanding. I never drove through Navajo country again. Even years later, working different fields in different states, I avoided Route 191 and everything north of Farmington. Some shortcuts, I learned, weren't worth taking. Some photographs weren't worth capturing. And some things, once seen, could never be unseen, no matter how desperately you wanted to forget. The memory lived on, persistent and patient, waiting in the darkness of Red Valley for the next traveler foolish enough to break down under a thin moon, surrounded by ridges where ancient things still moved between the canyons, watching and waiting with yellow eyes that never blinked. The land west of Albuquerque, New Mexico, is a stark tapestry of sandstone mesas, ancient lava flows, and sun-bleached plains. It is a place where history is not measured in centuries, but in millennia. The Pueblo of Laguna and the Pueblo of Acoma are two of the oldest continuously inhabited communities in North America, their people having carved a life from this demanding environment for countless generations. Their cultural and spiritual identity is inextricably linked to the land itself. Specific mesas, springs, and rock formations are not just features of a landscape, but living sacred parts of their cosmology, repositories of power and memory that predate the concept of ownership as we understand it. To an outsider, much of this land falls under the purview of the Bureau of Land Management, BLM, designated for public use, grazing, mining, recreation. The boundaries are often marked by little more than a weathered fence post or a faded sign. For weekend adventurers from the city, these are abstract lines on a map, bureaucratic distinctions between one patch of dirt and another. For the people who have always been there, the indigenous communities whose ancestors watched the stars from these same ridges, they are something else entirely. They are the border between the mundane world and a place of immense power, a place where the oldest laws still hold sway, where the land itself watches and remembers. I am a mechanical engineer by training and by temperament. I solve problems. I trust data, coordinates, verified measurements. I had the spot picked out for weeks, maybe even a full month of research and planning. A perfect sandstone rise, coordinates cross-referenced between 3 different topographical maps and satellite imagery downloaded from USGS servers. It offered a clean, unobstructed view of the western sky, far from the light pollution of Albuquerque, yet less than a 90-minute drive from my apartment in the Northeast Heights. It was by every metric I valued: elevation, accessibility, light pollution index, distance from urban centers, the ideal location for stargazing. I had even checked historical weather data. September in the high desert promised clear skies 87% of the time. The 4 of us set out on a Friday afternoon in late September 2017. Me, my girlfriend Chloe, our friend Ben, and his colleague Maya. We cruised west on Interstate 40 in my truck, the familiar silhouette of the Sandia Mountains shrinking in the rearview mirror. Ben was telling some loud, rambling story about a competition at his CrossFit gym, something about deadlifts and a guy who passed out. Chloe was laughing, her hand resting on my knee as I drove. Maya, a graduate student in anthropology at the University of New Mexico, was quiet in the back seat, watching the landscape slide by with an intensity that struck me even then. She had a way of looking at things, at the mesas and the arroyos, as if she were reading a text I couldn't see, interpreting symbols in the contours of the earth itself. "Exit's coming up," I announced, breaking into Ben's story. "Not the main one for Laguna, the one after." A few miles past the casino and the old mission church, visible from the highway with its white stucco walls and twin bell towers, I took an exit that led to nothing but a frontage road running parallel to the interstate. The asphalt gave way to gravel after a quarter mile. A minute later, I turned the truck onto a dirt track that was barely more than 2 tire ruts in the pale earth, the kind of road that doesn't appear on GPS systems. The suspension groaned as we bounced over rocks and washouts. 20 minutes of this bone-jarring progress, the dust plume behind us visible in the side mirrors, and we came upon it. A single rust-brown metal T-post driven into the ground at an angle, as if the earth had tried to reject it. Bolted to it with rusted bolts was a faded sign, its surface pocked with what looked unmistakably like holes from a shotgun blast. The words were barely legible beneath layers of grime and sun damage. Private Pueblo land, no trespassing. Beneath that, in smaller letters, violators will be prosecuted. I stopped the truck, the engine idling, dust settling around us in the still air. "This is it?" Ben asked from the back seat, leaning forward between the front seats to see. "This is the old boundary?" "Exactly," I said, tapping a finger on the laminated BLM map I had on the passenger seat, one of 3 maps I'd brought. The land swap agreement was in 2007, 10 years ago. This sign is obsolete. According to the federal government, the official reservation line is another 2 miles east of here. We're on public land, perfectly legal. I verified it with the BLM field office in Albuquerque. Maya leaned forward, her gaze fixed on the sign with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Are you sure about that, Liam? Sometimes those boundary agreements are complicated. The federal maps don't always reflect what the Pueblo considers theirs. Sovereignty issues are—" "It's not complicated," I interrupted, hearing the edge in my own voice. "It's a line on a map, a legal survey conducted by the federal government. We're on public land. We have every right to be here." Ben clapped his hands together with false enthusiasm. "Good enough for the government, good enough for me. Let's find this 5-star resort of yours, Liam." I put the truck in gear and drove past the post without further discussion. In the side mirror, I saw Maya look back at the sign until we rounded a bend and a low ridge blocked it from view. I told myself her concerns were academic, theoretical. This was federal land. The map said so. The law said so. What else mattered? The spot was even better than the map had suggested. A wide, flat-topped sandstone formation that rose about 100 feet from the surrounding scrubland, accessible via a natural ramp of broken rock on its southern face. The surface was roughly the size of a tennis court, weathered smooth by millennia of wind. It gave us a commanding 360-degree view. To the east, the sky was already starting to show the faint dome of city glow from Albuquerque, a diffuse orange stain on the horizon. To the west, nothing but the vast, dark expanse of the El Malpais lava fields stretching toward Arizona, an ancient flow of basalt that looked like frozen black water. Directly across a wide, shallow canyon from our position, perhaps half a mile distant, was another mesa, slightly higher than ours. Its edge formed a sharp, dark line against the sky, its profile jagged with juniper and pinyon trees. Between us and that opposite ridge was emptiness, a canyon floor of pale dirt, scattered sage and stones. We were completely, utterly alone. No other tire tracks, no trash, no sign that anyone had been here in months, maybe years. I felt a surge of satisfaction as we unloaded the gear. This was what preparation looked like. This was what freedom meant. The ability to research, to plan, to execute, to claim a piece of public land and use it as intended. No crowds, no light pollution, no noise, just us and the stars. We set up camp quickly, working with the efficiency of people who'd done this before. The tents went up, 2 of them, a larger one for Chloe and me, a smaller one for Ben and Maya. The fire pit was established in a natural depression in the rock that would shelter the flames from wind. Within an hour we had a proper campsite, and soon the smell of grilling sausages cut through the clean, dry air. The sun hung low on the western horizon, turning the sky into a canvas of violent oranges and purples, the kind of sunset you only get in the desert where there's no humidity to soften the light. The initial mood was celebratory. Ben cracked open beers from the cooler. Chloe put on some music from a small Bluetooth speaker, something indie and mellow. We watched the high desert sunset paint the clouds, the temperature dropping noticeably as the sun descended. The transition from day to night happens fast in the desert, faster than people from humid climates expect. One moment there's light, the next, the world is shades of purple and gray. You know, Chloe said, leaning against me as we sat on camp chairs near the fire. Sometimes I forget how quiet it can get out here. There's nothing, not even crickets. She was right. The silence was profound, a solid thing that pressed in from all sides once Chloe turned off the music. In the city, silence is relative. There's always the hum of air conditioning, the distant sound of traffic, the ambient noise of human civilization. Here there was nothing. The absence of sound was so complete, it was almost audible, a ringing in the ears that might have been the sound of our own nervous systems. As the last sliver of sun vanished below the horizon and the sky transformed into a deep indigo scattered with emerging stars, I started setting up my telescope, a decent 8-inch Dobsonian I'd saved for months to buy. The thin air at this altitude made the stars look like holes punched in black velvet. I was pointing out the summer triangle to Chloe Vega, Deneb, Altair, when Maya, who had been sitting on the edge of the rise looking out over the canyon, her silhouette dark against the darkening sky, suddenly stiffened. Liam. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the night with an urgency that made us all turn. Who is that? We all turned to look where she was pointing, across the canyon toward the opposite ridge. On the crest of that mesa, silhouetted perfectly against the deep indigo of the twilight sky, were 4 figures. They were distinctly human in shape, heads, torsos, arms, legs, but that was the only discernible feature. They were impossibly still, standing evenly spaced from one another in a straight line, all facing directly toward our campsite. The distance was significant, perhaps half a mile. But even from this range, their absolute stillness was obvious, unnatural. People don't stand like that, motionless as statues, for no apparent reason. My mind immediately started cycling through explanations, that automatic problem-solving reflex that engineers develop. Other campers who'd gotten a late start, locals out for an evening hike who'd spotted our fire. Maybe they were curious about who was camping out here. Maybe they were trying to decide if we were on their land or public land, conducting their own survey of sorts. Probably just people from the Pueblo, Ben said, though his voice had lost its boisterous edge. The confidence had drained from it. He grabbed the high-powered binoculars from my truck's glove box, expensive Zeiss optics I'd bought for wildlife watching, and raised them to his eyes. He adjusted the focus wheel, then was silent for a long moment that stretched uncomfortably. "What do you see?" I asked, hearing the tension in my own voice. "I can't make out any features," he said slowly, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "No clothes, no faces, they just look dark, like shadows standing up. But they're definitely people. The shape is human. They're just too far away, maybe, or the light's wrong." An involuntary sensation moved down my back, that primitive animal response to being watched by something you can't identify. The distance was significant, but even from here their stillness was deeply wrong. People shift their weight, they move their heads, they gesture to each other. These figures did nothing. They simply stood, 4 evenly spaced shapes on a distant ridge, watching us in the gathering darkness. "Hello," Ben shouted suddenly, lowering the binoculars. His voice carried across the canyon, bouncing off the rocks, the sound quickly swallowed by the immense space. "We're just camping. Can you hear us?" There was no reply, no wave, no movement at all. The 4 shapes remained motionless, as if they hadn't heard, or as if our presence and Ben's shouting meant nothing to them. The silence that followed his shout seemed deeper than before, as if the land itself were holding something back. We stood there, the 4 of us clustered near the fire, watching them watch us. The sausages on the grill started to burn, the smell acrid and unpleasant. Chloe turned off her music without being asked. The silence rushed back in, heavier than before, oppressive in a way that silence shouldn't be. My rational mind kept offering explanations. They were too far away to hear us. They were just watching the sunset from the other side. They'd leave soon. But none of the explanations felt adequate. The feeling of being observed was too intense, too specific. "Maybe they're park rangers," Chloe offered, her voice small and uncertain. "Or BLM officers checking on campers." In the dark, without vehicles, without lights, Maya's voice was flat. She hadn't taken her eyes off the figures. "That's not rangers." For the next 2 hours, as we tried to eat our burned sausages and sat around the fire passing a bottle of whiskey that Ben had brought, the figures remained. We ate in near silence, our eyes constantly drawn back to them despite our attempts at normal conversation. As full night descended and the moon began to rise, a waning gibbous bright enough to cast shadows, they became harder to distinguish from the gnarled juniper trees that dotted the ridgeline. But we knew they were still there. Every time I looked, I could make them out. 4 vertical shapes against the slightly lighter sky, evenly spaced, still facing our direction. The feeling was inescapable. We were being observed, studied, judged. The back of my neck prickled constantly. I found myself fighting the urge to look over my shoulder at our own campsite, irrationally convinced that something was behind me. Though our position on top of the mesa meant nothing could approach without being visible. Finally, around 11 o'clock, the cold and a creeping sense of dread that had settled into all of us like a sickness drove us from the fire. "I'm turning in," Chloe said, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked at me with an expression that I recognized as barely controlled fear. "I can't sit here anymore with them watching." One by one we retreated to our tents, zipping the thin nylon walls shut against the vast silent dark and the feeling of eyes upon us. I lay there in my sleeping bag next to Chloe, my heart beating a little too fast, staring at the fabric ceiling that glowed faintly with reflected moonlight. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself that in the morning they would be gone, and we would laugh about how jumpy we'd been, how we'd let our imaginations run wild in an unfamiliar place. People do that in the wilderness. They see patterns in randomness, threat in the unknown. But as I listened to the profound, unnerving silence of the land, interrupted only by Chloe's irregular breathing beside me and the occasional creak of the tent fabric in a breeze I couldn't feel, I couldn't shake the image of those 4 motionless figures. They were still out there. I knew it, and they were still watching. I woke with a jolt, my heart hammering, from a dream I couldn't remember. The pale gray light of dawn was filtering through the thin nylon of the tent, turning everything inside a dim blue-green. My first conscious thought was of them. I unzipped the tent flap with a single sharp pull and looked out across the canyon before I was even fully awake. The opposite ridge was empty, just rock and juniper and pinyon pine stark against the brightening sky. The air was cold and still, that perfect desert morning clarity where you can see for miles. No movement, no figures, nothing but the landscape itself. The relief that washed over me was immediate and overwhelming, followed almost instantly by embarrassment. What had we been afraid of? People on a ridge, that's all it had been. Some locals, maybe teenagers, who'd seen our fire and decided to mess with the city people. They'd succeeded. We'd spent the night jumping at shadows. "They're gone," I said to Chloe, who was just stirring beside me in her sleeping bag, her hair a tangled mess. "The ridge is empty." Soon we were all out of our tents, coffee brewing on the camp stove, the morning ritual providing a flimsy shield against the memory of the night before. The smell of coffee, that universally comforting scent, did more to restore normalcy than anything else could have. "See," Ben said, stretching his arms over his head, his voice deliberately loud and cheerful. "Probably just some kids messing with us, got bored and went home. We totally let them get to us. We're idiots." "Exactly," I agreed, seizing on the logic of it with perhaps too much enthusiasm. "We'll probably see their tire tracks on the way out. 4 kids on dirt bikes or something, having a laugh at the gringos." Only Maya was quiet. She stood at the edge of the rise, sipping her coffee from a metal camping mug, and staring at the empty ridge as if she could still see the figures there, as if they'd left impressions on the air itself. When she finally turned back to us, her expression was troubled. "Did anyone else notice," she said carefully, "that we never saw them arrive or leave? They were just there, and then not there." "It got dark," Ben said dismissively. "We couldn't see everything. They probably left while we were in the tents." In complete silence, across terrain like that. Maya gestured at the canyon floor, the loose rock and scrub that would be impossible to navigate quietly, especially at night. "No flashlights, no sound." "Maya," I said, hearing the impatience in my voice, "it's daytime. They're gone. Let's just enjoy the morning and not—" "I'm just saying it was strange," she said quietly, then turned back to her coffee. We tried to salvage the day with our planned hike, a loop around the base of our mesa that would give us different perspectives of the landscape. But the mood was broken. The vast, silent landscape no longer felt like a majestic wilderness, an escape from urban life. It felt like an empty room where you knew someone was hiding, where the silence itself was a kind of presence. Every dark recess in the rocks, every oddly shaped tree drew our eyes. We kept glancing over our shoulders. The silence, which had seemed peaceful the previous afternoon, now felt expectant, as if the land were waiting for something. We cut the hike short after less than an hour and returned to the relative safety of the campsite on top of the mesa. The unspoken agreement was that we'd pack up after lunch and head back to Albuquerque a day early. No one said it directly, but we all felt it. We wanted to leave. This place no longer felt welcoming. It felt like we'd overstayed, like we were guests who'd missed the polite signals to go. As the sun began its descent that afternoon, the anxiety returned, thick, suffocating, undeniable. No one suggested music this time. We built the fire higher than necessary, its crackle and pop the only sounds pushing back against the immense quiet of the desert evening. We all kept scanning the opposite ridge, a shared compulsive habit we couldn't break. It remained empty. The juniper trees swayed slightly in a breeze we couldn't feel on our sheltered mesa top. Nothing else moved. For a few hours, as the light faded and the first stars appeared in the darkening eastern sky, I allowed myself to hope it was over. We'd have a quiet evening, sleep with the tent flaps open to the cool air, and drive home in the morning with a weird story to tell. Strange encounter with locals, spooked us, but nothing happened. We'd laugh about it eventually. Chloe had gone to the truck to get another jacket from behind the driver's seat. She was halfway back to the fire, about 20 feet away, when she stopped dead. A small, sharp gasp escaped her lips. She pointed, her hand trembling visibly even in the firelight. Liam. It was barely a whisper, all the air gone from her voice. My head snapped in the direction of her gaze. Every muscle in my body went rigid. At the base of our own sandstone rise, just at the edge where the firelight faded into darkness, was one of the figures. It stood in the same unnaturally rigid posture we'd seen across the canyon, a solid black shape against the scrub brush, no more than 100 yards away. It was human in outline, a head, shoulders, torso, but it absorbed light rather than reflecting it. It was a hole in the visible world shaped like a person. It hadn't been there 30 seconds before. I'd been looking in that direction while Chloe walked to the truck. There had been nothing. No shape, no movement, no sound of approach across the loose rock and gravel that surrounded our position. It was simply there now, as if it had materialized from the darkness itself. Panic, raw and electric, shot through our group. I started to yell something, a warning, a challenge. My voice wouldn't form words, it just came out as a strangled sound. My engineering mind was screaming at me that this was impossible, that objects don't appear, that there had to be an explanation, but my body was responding to something older than logic, pure animal terror. Pilot reacted with rage, fear twisting instantly into aggression. "I'm done with this," he snarled, his face contorted. He grabbed the heavy 4-cell mag light from the truck bed, the kind that's essentially a club with a light on it. "I'm done with this game."
Ben, no!
Maya cried out, stepping toward him. "Don't, Ben, stop," I yelled, finding my voice. "Don't go near it." He ignored us both. He strode toward the figure with deliberate, aggressive steps, the flashlight beam cutting a stark white path through the darkness. The beam swung wildly as he walked, illuminating scrub brush and rock. He walked with a purpose that was terrifying to watch, all his fear channeled into forward motion, into confrontation. The figure remained motionless, that same absolute stillness. As Ben closed the distance, 50 feet 40-30, something strange happened. When he was about 20 feet away, close enough that we should have been able to see detail, to see what it was made of, the figure seemed to thin. It didn't run or fade in the way a normal object would disappear. It was more like the darkness it was made of became indistinguishable from the deeper shadows of the juniper bushes behind it. The solid shape dispersed, broke apart into shadow and negative space, and then it was gone. Ben swept the powerful beam back and forth across the empty space where it had stood, the circle of white light revealing only sage and rock and twisted wood. "Nothing," he called back to us, his voice shaky but loud, almost angry. "It's gone. There's nothing here. Nothing." He walked back to the fire, his face pale in the flickering light, the mag light hanging from his hand. He was trying to project bravado, trying to convince himself and us that he'd won some kind of confrontation, but his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the flashlight. "I'm going to my tent for a minute," he said abruptly. "I need a minute." He disappeared inside his tent, zipping it shut behind him. We heard him moving around inside, heard the rustle of fabric and equipment. Then, after maybe 30 seconds of silence, we heard a choked, guttural cry of pure horror. We all rushed to his tent and threw back the flap, our hands clumsy with fear. Ben was sitting on his sleeping bag, his shirt pulled off, twisted in his hands. He was staring at his own reflection in a small hand mirror, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. Across his back, from shoulder blade to lower ribs, were 3 deep parallel gouges. They were raw and red against his skin, the edges inflamed. They were perfectly straight, as if drawn with a ruler, each line exactly parallel to the others, spaced about an inch apart. Yet they had depth and texture. They looked like claw marks, like something with 3 curved talons had raked down his back with precision. They were beginning to bleed, dark fluid welling up along the lines and running down toward his waist. "Nothing touched me," he whispered, his voice trembling uncontrollably as he looked up at us. His eyes were wide, the whites visible all around the iris, prey animal eyes. I was just standing there. I turned around. Nothing touched me. Nothing was there. But this, he gestured helplessly at his back, at the impossible wounds that had appeared without cause. That broke me. My carefully constructed wall of logic, of rational explanations, of materialist certainty, crumbled into dust. This was not a prank. This was not a misunderstanding or a trick of the light or shared hysteria. This was real. Whatever was happening here operated by rules I didn't understand, in a reality that didn't match the physics I'd spent years studying. "Pack everything," I ordered, my voice tight and unfamiliar, the voice of someone trying to maintain control while their world collapsed. "Pack it now. We're leaving. We're leaving right now." Absolute animal terror gave us a frantic energy. We threw our gear into the bed of the truck with clumsy, desperate haste. Tents were collapsed without being folded, stakes left in the ground. Sleeping bags were tossed in still in their stuff sacks. The cooler of food was abandoned entirely next to the dead fire, too heavy to bother with. The telescope, my expensive telescope, was thrown in the truck bed without its case, the optics exposed. All that mattered was getting into the steel cage of the truck and driving away from this place. I jumped into the driver's seat, Chloe beside me, with Maya and a pale, shivering Ben in the back seat. My hands were shaking so badly it took me 2 tries to get the key into the ignition. I turned it. The engine turned over. I could hear it cranking, that healthy, strong sound of a starter motor engaging. It did not catch. The engine didn't fire. I tried again, my foot pumping the gas pedal. Nothing. The engine cranked and cranked, the battery strong, the starter working perfectly, but the engine itself refused to start. It was a simple, mechanical, and complete refusal. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, my knuckles white. I tried again and again, my initial panic giving way to a rising tide of helpless fury. The headlights blazed, the dashboard lit up like a Christmas tree. The radio would have played if I'd turned it on. Every electronic component was functioning perfectly. But the engine, the simple internal combustion engine that I understood on a mechanical level, that I could disassemble and rebuild, would not fire. A small, horrified sound came from Maya in the back seat. "Liam, stop." Her voice was so strange, so flat and certain, that I actually did stop cranking the engine. I turned to look at her. She was staring out the back window at the ground illuminated by the truck's reverse lights, her face pressed against the glass. She slowly opened her door and got out. I followed, my legs barely supporting my weight, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. By the stark white light of the headlamps and the red glow of the taillights, Maya pointed to the ground with a steady hand. Scratched into the hard-packed dirt, etched deep enough to be visible in the angled light, was a circle. It was nearly perfect, maybe 30 feet in diameter. It enclosed the truck, the dead fire pit, and the flattened spaces where our tents had been. Within its boundary, carved into the earth with a precision that shouldn't have been possible without surveying equipment, were symbols. They were intricate, disturbing in their complexity. Some were sharp geometric patterns, triangles within triangles, spirals that hurt to follow with your eyes, angular shapes that seemed to have too many sides. Others looked like stylized forms of animals, something with a curved spine and too many legs, a bird with wings spread at angles that violated symmetry, a figure that might have been human or might have been something else, its limbs bent in directions that bones don't bend. The symbols covered the interior of the circle, overlapping and interconnecting, a language or a map or a warning that we couldn't read. They hadn't been there that morning. I had walked over this ground. I had looked at it in daylight. They surrounded us completely now, a boundary drawn in the earth itself. We were trapped. There was no discussion about trying to cross the circle. The symbols etched into the dirt were a barrier more absolute than a concrete wall, more real than any fence or gate. We understood that in a way that bypassed rational thought. To cross that line would be to invite something worse than we'd already experienced. The rules of this place, whatever they were, had been made clear. We rebuilt the fire, piling on wood until the flames leaped 6 feet high, pushing back the darkness in a circle of desperate light. But the fire offered no real comfort. It just made the darkness beyond seem deeper, more solid, and more filled with intent. We huddled together, 4 people on a tiny island in an ocean of hostile silence. I don't think any of us slept. We sat in camp chairs, pulled close to the fire, our backs to each other so we could watch all directions at once. Every half hour, like a grim ritual driven by desperate hope, I would get up, walk to the truck, and turn the key. The result was always the same, the healthy, strong crank of a perfectly functional starter motor, and an engine that simply refused to catch. It was mechanically impossible, and yet it happened again and again. After each failure, I would return to the fire, the metallic taste of dread thick in my mouth, and report the same thing. Nothing, it won't start. We didn't see the figures again, not directly, but the feeling of being scrutinized, of being watched by something that did not have eyes as we understand them, was a physical weight. The air itself felt heavy, dense with a pressure that made it hard to draw a full breath. My ears popped repeatedly, as if the atmospheric pressure were changing, though my altimeter watch showed we were at the same elevation. The silence was wrong. In a natural place, there's always sound, wind, insects, small animals moving. Here, there was nothing. Even the fire seemed to burn quietly, as if the sound of crackling wood were being absorbed by something unseen. We just sat there, feeding wood into the flames, waiting for the sun. Around 3 in the morning, Maya spoke for the first time in hours. "We crossed a boundary," she said quietly, staring into the fire. "Not the one marked by that sign. Something older." "What do you mean?" Chloe asked, her voice hoarse from not speaking. "The Pueblo people, they have concepts that don't translate well. Restricted areas, places where certain ceremonies happen, or where things live that shouldn't be disturbed. They're not marked on maps, they're passed down generation to generation. Oral tradition. This might be one of those places." "How were we supposed to know that?" Ben said, his voice cracking. He'd wrapped himself in a blanket, shivering despite the fire's heat. The scratches on his back had stopped bleeding, but the wounds were still there, visible and impossible. "That's the point," Maya said, her voice infinitely sad. "We weren't supposed to be here at all. The boundaries aren't for outsiders. They're not on federal maps because the Pueblo doesn't recognize federal authority over certain lands. There are layers of ownership, layers of permission that the BLM doesn't acknowledge. We walked into something." She trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the thought. The hours until dawn were the longest of my life. Every sound, a shift in the fire, the creak of a camp chair made us flinch. We were all suffering from exhaustion, from adrenaline crash, from the sustained terror of being trapped in a place where the fundamental rules of reality seemed negotiable. The moment the eastern sky began to bleed from black to gray, a decision was made without a single word being spoken. We were walking out. I looked at my truck, my meticulously maintained Ford F-150, my pride, my proof of self-sufficiency. "We leave it all," I said. No one argued. I grabbed a backpack, stuffing it with the 4 remaining bottles of water, and I consulted my... The officer gave me a look that was a mixture of pity and annoyance, the expression of someone who'd wasted his morning on tourists who didn't know how to work their own equipment. "Sometimes you just gotta let it rest overnight," he said, as if offering a piece of folk wisdom. "Vapor lock, maybe. Heat of the day." He followed me back to the main road, then turned off with a brief wave, leaving us alone. The drive back to Albuquerque was conducted in a thick, suffocating silence. The radio stayed off. No one suggested food or bathroom breaks. We just drove, the highway disappearing under the truck's wheels, putting miles between us and that place. The easy camaraderie we'd shared just 2 days before was gone, destroyed utterly. It had been replaced by a shared trauma that was too monstrous to put into words, too far outside normal experience to discuss. We never properly spoke of it again. The group shattered in the weeks that followed. Ben quit his job at the engineering firm where he'd worked for 6 years. He left without notice, just stopped showing up. The last I heard, about a month after we got back, he was living with his parents in Rio Rancho, diagnosed with severe agoraphobia by a psychiatrist who probably thought Ben had suffered some kind of nervous breakdown. He refused to go outside. The scratches on his back healed into thin white scars, 3 parallel lines from shoulder blade to lower ribs, perfectly straight and evenly spaced. He would carry them forever. Physical proof of something that shouldn't have been able to happen. Chloe and I broke up 6 weeks later. It wasn't dramatic. There was no fight, no accusations. We just couldn't be around each other anymore. Every time we looked at each other, we saw the terror reflected in the other's eyes. We saw the memory of that night, of the figures, of the circle, of the absolute certainty that we were going to die out there. The relationship couldn't survive that. The trust was gone. Not trust in each other, but trust in the world itself, in the basic reliability of reality. That loss had hollowed us both out. Maya changed her major at UNM. She'd been in anthropology, specializing in southwestern indigenous cultures, planning on fieldwork and research. She switched to archival studies, choosing the quiet, predictable safety of library basements and climate-controlled storage rooms over ever setting foot in the field again. The last time I saw her, by chance in a coffee shop near campus, she looked haunted. She saw me, our eyes met, and she turned and left without saying a word. We both understood. There was nothing to say. As for me, the engineer, the man of logic and reason, the person who believed that reality operated on comprehensible principles, my world was broken. The simple mechanical fact of my truck refusing to start and then starting again was an impossibility I could not reconcile. Everything I understood about engines, about combustion, about cause and effect, said that if the battery was good and the starter was working, the engine would fire. But it hadn't. For hours it had refused, and then with a state police officer watching, it had worked perfectly. The symbols in the dirt that vanished, the figure that dispersed into shadow, the wounds on Ben's back that appeared from nothing, none of it could be true. All of it was true. I had seen it. I had experienced it. The world no longer operated on the principles I understood, and if those principles were wrong, then I had no foundation, no way to interpret reality, no tools to navigate existence. New Mexico, the place where I was born and raised, the landscapes I had loved for their stark beauty and their seeming purity, now felt alien and threatening. I couldn't drive past the Sandia Mountains without thinking about what might exist in the spaces between, in the areas that weren't marked on maps, in the places that indigenous communities knew to avoid. I couldn't look at the desert without wondering what old rules still applied there, what laws predated human understanding. 6 months after that weekend, 6 months of bad sleep and increasing dissociation, of avoiding any place that wasn't urban and well lit, I made a decision. I sold my truck to a dealer for less than it was worth because I couldn't stand to be in it. I put in for a transfer with my company's European division, citing a desire for international experience. I took a position with an engineering firm in Munich, Germany. I left the vast open spaces of the Southwest for the old human-built certainty of Europe. I left the land that stretched farther than you could walk for cities where every square meter had been mapped and claimed and built upon for 1,000 years. I left the desert silence for the constant urban noise. I have not been back to New Mexico since. Sometimes, late at night in my apartment in Munich, I pull up satellite view on my computer. I look at that part of New Mexico, at the area west of Albuquerque, at the spaces between Laguna and Acoma. I zoom in until I can see individual mesas, individual roads. I look at the patch of pale sandstone where we camped. I know exactly where it is. I still have the coordinates in a file somewhere, a meaningless speck in a sea of brown and green. The wind and rain have smoothed over our tire tracks by now, certainly. The land shows no evidence we were ever there. It remains quiet and undisturbed under the vast empty sky, looking exactly as it did before we arrived, exactly as it will look for centuries to come. The land holds its silence. The boundaries remain, marked or unmarked. The trespassers are gone, scattered across the country, broken in different ways by the same experience. And the land endures, keeping its laws, keeping its secrets, waiting with an infinite patience that we can never understand. March 15th, 2009 will forever be burned into my memory as the night that changed everything. I was 15 years old then, living with my father in a remote cabin nestled deep within 25 acres of dense woodland that straddled the border between Georgia and Tennessee. The isolation that once felt like freedom would soon become our prison. Our cabin sat at the end of a winding dirt road that carved through towering pines and ancient oaks. The nearest neighbor lived 10 miles away through treacherous mountain terrain, and cell phone service was virtually non-existent. We had chosen this location specifically for its seclusion. My father craved the peace that only true wilderness could provide after years of city living had worn him down. What we hadn't anticipated was how that isolation would trap us when terror came knocking. The day had started normally enough. I spent most of the afternoon working on homework while my father repaired fence posts along our property line. Our German Shepherd, Scout, had been my constant companion since we'd rescued him as a puppy 6 months earlier. He was still young, barely 8 months old, but already showing the intelligence and loyalty that made his breed legendary. Scout followed me everywhere, his dark eyes alert and his ears always perked for any unusual sound. As evening approached, the weather began to deteriorate rapidly. What had started as light cloud cover transformed into an ominous wall of storm clouds rolling in from the west. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in less than an hour, and the wind picked up significantly, causing the massive trees around our cabin to sway and creak in ways that made my skin crawl. The weatherman on our old television had predicted severe thunderstorms, but living in the mountains, we were accustomed to nature's dramatic displays. By 7 o'clock, the first fat raindrops began spattering against our windows with increasing intensity. The wind howled through the trees with a sound that seemed almost alive, almost angry. I remember thinking how the storm seemed particularly violent, even for our area known for its unpredictable weather patterns. The rain quickly escalated from gentle drops to a torrential downpour that hammered our metal roof with a deafening rhythm. Lightning began flashing with alarming frequency, illuminating our property in stark, white bursts that revealed the trees bending at impossible angles. Thunder followed seconds later, each crash seeming to shake the very foundation of our small cabin. Scout became increasingly agitated, pacing between the windows and whimpering softly, behavior that was completely unlike his usually calm demeanor. My father secured the shutters and double-checked that all our emergency supplies were easily accessible. We had learned early in our wilderness living to always be prepared for extended power outages. Our backup generator sat in a small shed 50 feet from the cabin, and we kept multiple flashlights, battery-powered radios, and enough canned food to last a week stored in our pantry. The storm's intensity continued building throughout the evening. What had started as a typical spring thunderstorm evolved into something far more sinister. The wind reached speeds that made our cabin's wooden frame groan and protest with each powerful gust. Tree branches scraped against our roof with sounds that resembled fingernails on a chalkboard, setting my nerves on edge. As the night deepened, the storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, it seemed to be growing stronger, more violent. The lightning strikes became so frequent that our cabin was illuminated almost continuously in an eerie, strobing light that cast dancing shadows throughout our home. Each thunderclap seemed louder than the last, rattling our windows and making normal conversation nearly impossible. Scout's behavior became increasingly erratic as the storm intensified. He would stand at different windows, his hackles raised and his body rigid with tension, staring out into the darkness as if he could see something that remained invisible to us. His low growls were barely audible over the storm's chaos, but I could feel the vibrations through the floorboards when I sat near him. At exactly 9:47 p.m., the power went out. The sudden plunge into darkness was jarring after hours of the strobing lightning. Our cabin, which had felt cozy and secure just moments before, suddenly seemed vulnerable and exposed. The familiar hum of our refrigerator, the gentle glow of our table lamps, the reassuring presence of our television, all vanished in an instant, leaving us surrounded by an oppressive blackness that seemed to press against us from all sides. I was in the living room when it happened, having just finished watching an episode of The Dukes of Hazzard on our old television set. The show had been a comforting distraction from the storm's fury, its light-hearted action providing a stark contrast to the violence raging outside our walls. When the screen went black and the familiar background noises of our electronic devices died away, the full force of the storm's sound seemed to double in intensity. The rain pounding our roof became thunderous without the buffer of background noise. The wind's howling took on an almost human quality, rising and falling in patterns that seemed deliberately menacing. Tree branches continued their assault on our roof and walls, but now each scrape and thud made me jump with startled fear. Scout immediately moved to my side, his warm body pressing against my leg as if sensing my growing unease. Even in the darkness, I could feel his tension. His muscles coiled and ready for action, his breathing quick and shallow. His behavior was becoming increasingly concerning, as if he sensed something in the storm that went beyond mere weather. I fumbled around in the darkness, my hands searching for the heavy-duty flashlight my father always kept on the coffee table for emergencies. The familiar weight of the metal casing felt reassuring in my grip as I clicked it on, sending a beam of bright LED light cutting through the blackness. The cone of illumination revealed our living room exactly as I had left it, but somehow everything looked different in the harsh, artificial light. Shadows seemed deeper. Corners appeared more ominous. The logical thing to do was find my father and discuss our situation. Our backup generator could restore power, but running it during such a violent storm posed risks. Lightning strikes on metal could be catastrophic, and the generator's noise might mask important sounds, like someone approaching our isolated cabin. I called out for my father, but my voice was swallowed by the storm's roar. He was likely in his bedroom at the far end of our cabin, possibly already preparing emergency equipment or trying to reach someone on his battery-powered radio. Our cabin wasn't large, but the storm made communication between rooms nearly impossible without shouting. As I began moving toward his room, flashlight beams sweeping ahead of me, Scout suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. His entire body went rigid, and a low growl began rumbling in his throat, a sound I had never heard from him before. It was deeper, more primal than his usual warning growls when strangers approached our property. This sound spoke of genuine fear, of instinctual recognition of danger. I stopped walking and listened intently, trying to discern what had triggered Scout's reaction. At first I heard only the storm, wind, rain, thunder, and the creaking of our cabin's wooden structure. But then, underneath the natural chaos, I detected something else. Something that didn't belong. It was a sound barely perceptible above the storm's noise, but distinctly different from the natural symphony of wind and rain. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and completely out of place in our wilderness setting. As I strained to identify it, my blood began to pump faster and my breathing became shallow with growing anxiety. The sound was footsteps. Heavy, measured footsteps circling our cabin in the darkness, just audible enough to confirm they weren't my imagination. Each step landed with significant weight, far heavier than any normal person would produce. The rhythm was slow and deliberate, as if whatever was making them was taking time to examine our home, studying it for weaknesses or points of entry. Scout's growling intensified and he began backing away from the windows, pressing closer to me as if seeking protection. His ears were pinned back against his head, and I could see the whites of his eyes in my flashlight beam. Clear signs of extreme distress in a dog that had never shown fear of anything. The footsteps continued their circuit around our cabin, pausing occasionally at what I assumed were our windows and doors. During these pauses, the silence became even more terrifying than the sound of movement. I imagined whatever was out there pressing its face against our glass, studying the interior of our home, planning its next move. The realization that something was deliberately circling our cabin sent waves of terror coursing through my body. This wasn't a lost hiker seeking shelter, nor was it one of the occasional hunters who sometimes wandered onto our property. The methodical nature of the movement, combined with Scout's obvious fear, told me that whatever was outside posed a genuine threat. I forced myself to remain as quiet as possible, controlling my breathing and moving with careful precision to avoid making any noise that might alert our unwelcome visitor to my exact location within the cabin. The flashlight in my hand suddenly felt like both a necessity and a liability. I needed its light to navigate safely, but its beam could potentially reveal my position to whatever was watching from outside. The footsteps paused directly outside our largest window, the one that faced our small front porch. I could hear what sounded like shuffling, as if something was positioning itself for a better view inside. The storm's lightning provided occasional illumination of our property, but the flashes were too brief and chaotic to reveal any clear details of what lurked in the darkness. Scout's behavior became increasingly agitated. He began moving in tight circles, his claws clicking against our hardwood floors despite his obvious attempts to remain quiet. His instincts were screaming danger, and his canine senses were detecting threats that remained invisible to me. The low growling continued rumbling in his throat, occasionally punctuated by barely audible whimpers of fear. I knew I needed to reach my father immediately. Whatever was outside our cabin required both of our attention and all of our resources to handle safely. But the journey from our living room to his bedroom at the far end of the cabin now seemed like an impossible distance to cover without being detected. The footsteps resumed their circuit, this time moving toward the side of our cabin where my father's bedroom was located. Each step seemed heavier than the last, and I began to wonder just how large whatever was making them might be. The weight behind each footfall suggested something far bigger than any normal person, perhaps 6.5 feet tall, and built with the solid mass of someone who performed heavy physical labor their entire life. As the presence moved along our cabin's exterior walls, I became aware of additional sounds that chilled me to my core. There were subtle scratching noises, as if whatever was outside was testing our walls and siding for weak points. Occasionally, I heard what sounded like sniffing, deep, deliberate inhalations, as if our visitor was trying to gather information about the occupants inside through scent. The methodical nature of this examination was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of our situation. This wasn't random vandalism or the actions of someone under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Whatever was outside was conducting a systematic reconnaissance of our home, gathering intelligence before making its next move. Lightning flashed again, and for a brief moment I thought I saw a shadow moving past our front window. Something tall and broad that didn't match the silhouette of any animal native to our area. The shape was vaguely humanoid, but wrong in proportions that I couldn't quite identify in the brief illumination. Scout suddenly bolted toward my father's room, his fear apparently overcoming his instinct to stay close to me. His claws scrambled for purchase on our smooth floors as he rounded the corner leading to the bedroom hallway. I could hear his frantic scratching at my father's door, accompanied by urgent whimpering that would definitely wake my father if the storm hadn't already done so. The footsteps outside stopped abruptly. Whatever had been circling our cabin became completely motionless, and the sudden absence of sound was far more terrifying than the steady rhythm of movement had been. I realized that Scout's desperate flight to my father's room had likely been heard by our uninvited guest. The silence stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, creating a tension that made my hands shake and my heart pound so loudly I was certain it could be heard outside. Then came a new sound that nearly made me drop my flashlight in terror. Someone, or something, was testing our front door handle. The metallic clicking of the latch being manipulated was clearly audible, despite the storm's ongoing fury. Our door was locked, but the sound of someone attempting to gain entry sent panic surging through my entire body. I backed away from the front of our cabin, keeping my flashlight beam pointed at the door while trying to control my breathing enough to think clearly. The handle continued turning back and forth, each movement deliberate and patient. There was no frantic urgency in these attempts, no signs of panic or desperation. Whatever was trying to get inside was taking its time, methodically testing our defenses and looking for the easiest way to gain entry. I heard my father's bedroom door open, followed by his urgent voice calling my name. Scout's warning had successfully alerted him to our situation, but now we faced the challenge of communicating our danger without alerting whatever was outside to our exact positions and numbers. "Don't move," my father's voice carried down the hallway in a harsh whisper that barely reached me over the storm's continuous roar. "Stay exactly where you are and don't make any sudden movements." The urgency in his tone was unlike anything I had ever heard before. My father was a man who prided himself on remaining calm under pressure. He had served 2 tours in the military and worked for 15 years as a firefighter before we moved to our mountain retreat. Hearing genuine fear in his voice sent my terror to new heights and confirmed that our situation was far more serious than I had initially realized. I remained frozen in place, flashlight beam still focused on our front door, where the handle had stopped moving but remained turned to the unlocked position. The door itself hadn't opened, suggesting that our deadbolt was still engaged, but the fact that someone had successfully manipulated our main lock was deeply disturbing. "I can see you from my window," my father continued in that same urgent whisper. "Listen to me very carefully. There's something outside that isn't human. It's not like any animal I've ever seen, and it's not like any person either. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" His words hit me like physical blows. My father wasn't given to exaggeration or flights of fancy. He was a practical man who dealt in facts and evidence, someone who had seen enough real danger in his lifetime to accurately assess threats. If he was telling me that whatever was outside our cabin wasn't human, then I had no choice but to believe him completely. "What do you mean it's not human?" I whispered back, my voice barely audible even to myself. "I mean exactly what I said," he replied, and I could hear him moving around his room, probably gathering weapons and emergency supplies. I got a clear look at it when lightning lit up the backyard. It's walking on 2 legs like a person, but it's wrong. The proportions are all wrong, the way it moves is wrong, and the size is wrong. It has to be nearly 7 feet tall and built like someone who could lift a car without effort. Scout had apparently remained in my father's room because I could hear his continued whimpering and the sound of his claws scratching against the wooden floor. Even our dog, with his limited understanding of the situation, recognized that whatever was outside posed a threat unlike anything in his previous experience. "Can you make it back here without being seen?" my father asked. I evaluated the distance between my current position and his room. The hallway was straight and relatively short, but it required passing directly beneath 2 windows that faced different sides of our property. If whatever was outside had moved since testing our front door, there was a significant chance it might see me crossing between rooms. "I think so," I whispered back, "but what if it sees me moving?" "Then you run as fast as you can and don't look back," he replied without hesitation. "I've got my shotgun loaded and ready, but we need to be together if this thing decides to force its way inside." The thought of our cabin being invaded by something my father described as not human made my stomach clench with nausea. Our home, which had always felt secure and protected, suddenly seemed fragile and vulnerable. The wooden walls that had kept out weather and wildlife now felt inadequate against a threat that my father, with all his military and emergency response experience, couldn't easily categorize. I began moving slowly toward his room, keeping my flashlight beam pointed at the floor to minimize the chances of it being spotted from outside. Each step felt monumental, and I found myself holding my breath as I passed beneath the first window. The storm continued raging outside, providing some cover for any small sounds I might make, but also masking any noise our unwelcome visitor might produce. As I reached the halfway point of my journey, new sounds began emanating from outside our cabin. There was a rhythmic thumping against our walls, as if something was systematically testing the structural integrity of our home. Each impact was substantial enough to slightly vibrate the floorboards beneath my feet, suggesting tremendous force behind whatever was making them. "It's testing the walls," my father's voice carried a note of grim understanding. "It's looking for weak spots or places where it might be able to break through." The methodical nature of this examination was perhaps more terrifying than violent assault would have been. Violence implied emotion, passion, or desperation, human motivations that could be understood and potentially reasoned with. This systematic approach suggested intelligence and planning, characteristics that made our situation exponentially more dangerous. I finally reached my father's room and slipped inside, immediately turning to help him secure the door. He had already moved his heavy dresser partway across the entrance, creating a barricade that would slow down any attempts at forced entry. His face was pale in the flashlight beam, and I could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold temperature. Scout immediately pressed against my legs, his warm body trembling with fear, but his presence providing some small comfort in our terrifying situation. My father's shotgun lay across his bed, its dark metal gleaming in the artificial light. Boxes of shells sat open beside it, and I realized he had been preparing for the possibility of armed conflict. "What exactly did you see?" I asked, needing more details to understand what we were facing. "Something that walks upright like a man but moves like a predator," he replied grimly. "Its arms hang down past where they should, and its head doesn't sit on its shoulders the way a person's would." When the lightning illuminated it, I could see its outline clearly against the trees. And I'm telling you, it's not anything that should exist in nature. The systematic examination of our cabin's exterior continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Whatever was outside moved with patience and deliberation that suggested it had all the time in the world to find a way inside. The thumping against our walls became more focused, concentrating on areas where our structure might be weakest, around windows, near the foundation, and at the corners where support beams joined. My father moved around his room with military precision, checking his ammunition supply and ensuring that his radio equipment was functioning properly. Our landline phone had gone dead when the power failed, and our cell phones showed no signal bars, leaving us completely cut off from outside help. The battery-powered emergency radio crackled with static and distant weather reports, but no voices that might provide assistance or guidance. "We need to consider the possibility that this thing might actually get inside," my father said quietly, his training overriding his fear enough to think tactically about our situation. "If that happens, we need to be ready to defend ourselves or escape quickly." He pulled out a detailed map of our property and the surrounding wilderness, spreading it across his bed in the flashlight beam. Using his finger, he traced potential escape routes that would lead us away from our cabin and toward the nearest road where we might encounter other people or find help. "The problem is that we don't know if this is just one individual or if there might be others," he continued, his voice grim with realization. "If we run outside and there are more of them waiting, we could be trapped in the open with nowhere to hide." Scout suddenly lifted his head from where he had been lying beside the bed, his ears perked forward and his body rigid with attention. A low growl began rumbling in his throat, but this time it carried a different quality, less fear and more warning, as if he had detected a change in our situation that required immediate attention. The sounds from outside our cabin had stopped completely. The abrupt silence was far more ominous than the systematic testing had been. At least when we could hear movement, we knew where our unwelcome visitor was located and what it was doing. Now, in the absence of any audible activity, our imaginations began filling the void with possibilities that were somehow worse than the reality we had been experiencing. "It's repositioning," my father whispered, moving toward his window but staying well back from the glass. "Whatever it was doing out there, it's finished, and now it's moving to the next phase of whatever it has planned." The storm continued its assault on our cabin, but even the thunder and lightning seemed subdued compared to the tension that now filled our small space. Every sound became suspect. Every shadow in our flashlight beams could potentially hide something threatening. The familiar surroundings of my father's bedroom now felt like a bunker under siege. Then we heard it. The unmistakable sound of our front door opening. Despite our deadbolt, despite our locked handle, despite every precaution we had taken, something had gained entry to our cabin. The hinges creaked slightly as the door swung open, followed by the distinct sound of heavy footsteps crossing our threshold and entering our living room. "How is that possible?" I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. My father's face had gone completely pale, and his hands tightened around his shotgun with white-knuckled intensity. He moved closer to our bedroom door, listening intently to the sounds coming from the front of our cabin. Scout pressed himself against the floor, his body language indicating that he wanted to hide but was prepared to fight if necessary. The footsteps moved slowly through our living room, pausing occasionally as if whatever had entered was examining our belongings or familiarizing itself with the layout of our home. Each footfall was heavy and deliberate, confirming my father's assessment about the size and weight of our intruder. "We need to get out of here right now," my father whispered urgently. "Whatever that thing is, it's inside our house, and we don't want to be trapped in here with it." He moved to his window and carefully examined the screen and latch mechanism. Our cabin sat elevated on a foundation that put the bedroom windows about 4 feet off the ground. Not an impossible drop, but one that would require careful maneuvering, especially in the darkness and storm conditions. The footsteps in our living room began moving toward the back of the cabin, heading in the direction of our hallway and bedrooms. Whatever had entered our home was conducting the same methodical examination of the interior that it had performed outside, systematically exploring each room and gathering information about the layout. "It's coming this way," my father said grimly. "We have maybe 30 seconds before it reaches this door." He quickly began removing the screen from his window while I gathered our emergency supplies and prepared Scout for an escape attempt. The storm's wind immediately began whipping rain into the room through the open window, but the discomfort was insignificant compared to our need to escape whatever was moving through our cabin. The footsteps in the hallway grew louder and more distinct. I could hear them pausing at each room, accompanied by sounds that suggested doors were being opened and interiors examined. Whatever was searching our home was being thorough, leaving no space unexplored as it moved closer to our location. "You go first," my father ordered, helping me climb through the window opening. "Take Scout and head for the tree line. Don't stop running until you reach the main road." Just as I swung my leg over the windowsill, preparing to drop to the ground outside, the sound of splintering wood erupted from the front of our cabin. The crash was enormous, easily audible over the storm's fury, and was followed immediately by the unmistakable sound of our front door being ripped from its hinges with tremendous force. "Change of plans," my father said grimly, pulling me back inside and moving quickly to barricade our bedroom door with additional furniture. Whatever that was, it just demonstrated that locked doors aren't going to slow it down much. The heavy footsteps that had been methodically exploring our cabin now moved with increased speed and purpose. Whatever had been inside was no longer being cautious about detection. It knew we were here, and it was coming directly for our location. The sound of its movement suggested something far larger and more powerful than any normal intruder. Scout began barking frantically, his courage finally overcoming his fear as his protective instincts kicked in. The sharp, aggressive barks echoed through our small cabin, providing the first real sound of defiance since our ordeal began. My father didn't try to quiet him. At this point, stealth was no longer an option, and Scout's warning might serve as a deterrent. The thing in our hallway paused outside our bedroom door. I could hear it breathing, deep, labored inhalations that sounded wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. The rhythm was too slow, the volume too great, and there was a wet, congested quality that suggested something fundamentally different from normal human respiratory patterns. Then came the first impact against our door. The entire frame shook with the force of the blow, and I could see the wood beginning to crack around the hinges. Our barricade of furniture shifted slightly but held firm, buying us precious seconds to prepare for what seemed inevitable. My father raised his shotgun, positioning himself to have a clear line of fire when the door finally gave way. "Stay behind me and be ready to run," he instructed, his voice steady despite the terror of our situation. "If this goes badly, you take Scout, and you get out of here no matter what happens to me." The second impact was even stronger than the first. The door frame splintered visibly, and our furniture barricade slid backward several inches across the floor. Whatever was trying to break in possessed strength that defied rational explanation. The kind of force that should have required heavy machinery or multiple people working together. Scout positioned himself between us and the door, his hackles raised and his teeth bared in a display of aggression that would have been impressive against any normal threat. But as the third impact shook our entire room, I realized that his courage, while admirable, would be little protection against whatever possessed the power to demolish our defenses so easily. The fourth impact finally breached our door. Wood exploded inward in a shower of splinters and debris, and our furniture barricade was scattered across the room as if it weighed nothing. Through the destroyed entrance, I caught my first glimpse of what had been terrorizing us, and the sight would haunt my nightmares for years to come. It stood nearly 7 feet tall, just as my father had described, but the reality was far more terrifying than any description could convey. Its proportions were wrong in every conceivable way. Arms that hung too low, shoulders that were too broad, and a head that sat at an unnatural angle on its massive frame. In the chaotic illumination of our flashlight beams and the storm's lightning, I could see that its clothing was torn and filthy, as if it had been living in the wilderness for an extended period. But it was the face that would forever be burned into my memory. What I could see of its features in the erratic lighting appeared human, but distorted, as if someone had taken a normal person and stretched and twisted their characteristics into something that triggered every instinctual fear response built into human psychology. The eyes reflected our flashlight beams like those of a nocturnal animal, and when it opened its mouth, I could see teeth that were far too large and too sharp for any person. My father didn't hesitate. The shotgun boomed in the confined space of our bedroom, the muzzle flash temporarily blinding us all, and the concussion making my ears ring. But instead of falling or retreating, the thing simply staggered backward half a step and then began moving forward again, apparently more annoyed than injured by the blast. "Run!" my father shouted, working the action on his shotgun to chamber another round. "Get out of here right now!" But there was nowhere to run. The thing filled our doorway completely, blocking our only exit from the room. The window remained open behind us, but reaching it would require getting past our intruder or somehow convincing it to move aside, neither of which seemed likely given its apparent hostile intentions. The creature took another step into our room, and I could smell something that made my stomach lurch with revulsion. It was a combination of wet earth, rotting vegetation, and something else that I couldn't identify but that triggered every warning signal in my primitive brain. This was the smell of something that didn't belong in the civilized world, something that existed outside the normal boundaries of human experience. Scout launched himself at the intruder with a ferocity that surprised everyone, including the creature itself. His attack was brave but ultimately futile. The thing simply swatted him aside with one massive arm, sending our dog crashing into the wall with a yelp of pain and surprise. Scout hit the floor hard but immediately scrambled back to his feet, apparently more stunned than seriously injured. My father fired again, this time aiming higher and achieving what appeared to be a more effective hit. The creature stumbled backward through our destroyed doorway, giving us our first opportunity to escape since the siege began. "The window now!" he commanded, and this time I didn't hesitate. I threw myself through the window opening without considering the drop, landing hard on the rain-soaked ground outside my father's bedroom. The impact drove the breath from my lungs and sent sharp pains shooting through my knees and ankles, but adrenaline masked most of the discomfort. Scout landed beside me a second later, apparently having made the same leap with more canine grace. My father followed immediately after, clutching his shotgun and a small emergency bag. He hit the ground running, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the tree line, without pausing to assess our surroundings or check for injuries. Behind us, I could hear the creature moving through our cabin, its heavy footsteps accompanied by the sounds of furniture being overturned and walls being damaged. "Don't look back," my father commanded as we ran through the storm toward the relative safety of the woods. "Whatever you do, don't look back and don't slow down until we reach the main road." The rain was falling in sheets that made visibility nearly impossible beyond a few feet. Lightning continued providing sporadic illumination of our flight path, but the brief flashes also created confusing shadows that made navigation treacherous. The ground beneath our feet was muddy and slippery, covered with fallen branches and debris from the storm's ongoing assault. Scout ran beside us, occasionally stumbling but maintaining our pace despite his earlier collision with the wall. His presence provided some comfort, but I could tell he was favoring his left side where he had impacted our bedroom wall. The fact that he continued running without complaint spoke to both his determination and the severity of our situation. Behind us, the sounds from our cabin grew louder and more destructive. I could hear glass breaking, wood splintering, and what sounded like entire sections of wall being torn apart. Whatever we had left behind was systematically destroying our home, either searching for something specific or simply venting its rage at our escape. What was that thing? I gasped as we pushed through the underbrush toward the dirt road that connected our property to the outside world. "I don't know," my father replied honestly, his breathing labored from our desperate flight. "But I know it wasn't anything natural, and I know we're lucky to be alive right now." The main road was still nearly a mile away through difficult terrain, and I was already beginning to feel the effects of our desperate sprint. My lungs burned from the cold air and physical exertion, and my legs felt increasingly unsteady as we navigated fallen logs and patches of thorny undergrowth. The storm continued hammering us with rain and wind, making our escape even more challenging. Lightning flashed again, and in that brief moment of illumination, I saw something that made my blood freeze in my veins. Far behind us, barely visible through the trees and rain, a tall figure was moving in our direction. It wasn't running, but its long stride was covering ground with alarming efficiency. Whatever we had left in our cabin had decided to pursue us into the wilderness. "It's following us," I managed to say between gasping breaths. My father glanced back just as another lightning flash confirmed my observation. His face went pale, and he immediately changed our direction, angling toward a section of forest where the trees grew more densely and might provide better concealment. "We need to find somewhere to hide until daylight," he said grimly. "Running in the open isn't going to work if that thing can track us through the forest." Scout seemed to understand our need for concealment, because he immediately began leading us toward a particularly thick stand of pine trees, whose low-hanging branches created natural shelter from both the storm and observation. We crawled underneath the dense canopy, pressing ourselves against the trunk of the largest tree and trying to control our breathing enough to listen for pursuit. The rain drumming against the pine needles above our heads provided some acoustic cover, but it also masked any sounds that might indicate whether our pursuer was still following our trail. We huddled together in the darkness, sharing body heat and drawing what comfort we could from each other's presence while we waited to see if our hiding place would be discovered. Minutes passed like hours as we strained to hear any indication of movement in the forest around us. The storm continued its assault, and occasionally lightning would illuminate our immediate surroundings, but we saw no sign of the creature that had destroyed our home and driven us into the wilderness. "We need to keep moving toward the road," my father finally whispered. "Staying here too long is just giving it more time to track us down." As we prepared to continue our escape, Scout suddenly lifted his head and looked back in the direction we had come. His ears were perked forward and a low growl began rumbling in his throat, the same warning sound he had made when the creature first approached our cabin. Whatever was hunting us through the forest had found our trail again. We spent the remainder of that terrifying night moving through the forest in short sprints, hiding whenever Scout's behavior indicated that our pursuer was getting close, and gradually working our way toward the main road where we might find help or at least escape our isolated predicament. The creature seemed to be tracking us with supernatural ability, always appearing to know our general direction despite our attempts at concealment and misdirection. Dawn finally began breaking around 6:30 in the morning, and with the first gray light filtering through the storm clouds, we heard the most welcome sound imaginable, the distant rumble of a vehicle on the main road. My father immediately began leading us toward the sound, abandoning all attempts at stealth in favor of speed as we crashed through the underbrush toward potential salvation. The truck belonged to our nearest neighbor, a man named Vernon, who lived 10 miles away and was apparently heading to town for supplies despite the storm conditions. When he saw 3 muddy, terrified people emerge from the forest and flag him down, he immediately pulled over and began asking questions that we were barely coherent enough to answer. "Something attacked our cabin," my father managed to explain between gasping breaths. "We need to get to town and call the police immediately." Vernon didn't ask for details. The obvious terror in our faces and our bedraggled condition were explanation enough. He helped us into his truck, made room for Scout in the back seat, and began driving toward town while my father used his cell phone to contact emergency services. The conversation with the 911 dispatcher was surreal. How do you explain to someone that your home was invaded by something that didn't appear entirely human? How do you describe footprints that looked more like claws than feet? How do you convince trained professionals to take seriously a report that sounded like something from a horror movie? The police arrived at our property 3 hours later, accompanied by paramedics and a representative from the sheriff's department. What they found confirmed our story in ways that were both validating and deeply disturbing. Our cabin had been completely destroyed, not just damaged, but systematically torn apart as if something with tremendous strength had gone room by room, pulling down walls and destroying everything inside. The tracks around our property were unlike anything the investigating officers had seen before. They were definitely made by something bipedal, but the size and shape were wrong for any known animal or person. The stride length suggested something nearly 7 feet tall, and the depth of the impressions in the muddy ground indicated weight that would have been impossible for a normal human. Inside our destroyed cabin, investigators found evidence of tremendous force being applied to structural elements that should have required heavy equipment to damage. Support beams had been snapped in half, walls had been punched through, and our furniture had been scattered as if it weighed nothing. The official report listed the incident as vandalism by unknown perpetrators, but I could see in the officers' faces that they knew this explanation didn't adequately account for the evidence they had documented. The amount of destruction would have required multiple people working with tools, but there were no tool marks on any of the damaged surfaces. Everything appeared to have been torn apart by hand. We never returned to live in those woods. My father arranged for a salvage crew to remove anything of value from the wreckage, but he refused to accompany them, and he insisted that they work only during daylight hours with multiple people present at all times. Even then, the crew reported feeling uneasy during their work, as if they were being watched from the surrounding forest. Scout recovered from his injuries within a few days, but his behavior was permanently changed by our experience. He became extremely protective of our family and showed signs of anxiety whenever we were in wooded areas or rural locations. Veterinarians found no physical explanation for his behavioral changes, but I understood completely. He had seen something that challenged his understanding of the natural world, just as we had. The insurance company eventually paid our claim, though the adjuster clearly had doubts about the official explanation for the damage. The amount of destruction was simply too extensive to have been caused by normal vandalism, and the specific patterns of damage suggested something that defied conventional explanation. We moved to a suburban neighborhood where our nearest neighbors were less than 100 feet away, and where the sound of human activity provided constant reassurance that we were not alone or isolated. My father sold his hunting equipment and showed no interest in outdoor activities that might take us away from populated areas. 10 years have passed since that night, and I still wake up sometimes from dreams where I can hear heavy footsteps circling my home in the darkness. I've never spoken publicly about what we experienced, and I doubt anyone would believe the complete truth even if I did. But I know what I saw, and I know what hunted us through those woods on that storm-torn night in March 2009. Whatever exists in the wilderness between Georgia and Tennessee, it's still out there. The forest holds secrets that civilization has forgotten, and sometimes those secrets decide to remind us that humanity's dominion over the natural world is neither complete nor permanent. We learned that lesson in the most terrifying way possible, and it's a knowledge that will stay with us for the rest of our lives. I often wonder if other families living in isolated areas have encountered similar experiences, and whether the official explanations for unexplained incidents adequately account for the reality of what might be sharing our world. But mostly, I'm grateful that we survived our encounter, and I pray that whatever we left behind in those woods remains content to stay hidden in the darkness where it belongs. The autumn of 2023 brought with it a series of disturbing reports that would forever change how I viewed the wilderness that had become my sanctuary. I was 26 then, working a mundane office job in Utrecht that left me feeling trapped between fluorescent lights and computer screens for most of my waking hours. The only thing that kept me sane was my nightly escapes into the forests that dotted the Dutch-German border region. It started with whispered conversations in local pubs, hushed discussions between farmers who gathered around weathered wooden tables, their faces etched with concern and confusion. The first official report came from a sheep farmer named Cornelis van der Berg, whose property stretched along the eastern edge of Gelderland province. On a foggy Tuesday morning in early October, he discovered 7 of his prize breeding ewes lying motionless in their pasture, their bodies arranged in an almost ceremonial pattern that made his stomach turn. The local veterinarian, Dr. Hendrika Vos, arrived within hours of the discovery. What she found defied her 30 years of experience treating livestock attacks. The sheep hadn't simply been killed, they had been systematically executed. Each animal bore identical wounds, a single devastating bite to the throat that had severed the carotid artery with surgical precision. The bite radius measured exactly 7 centimeters across, far larger than any domestic dog could produce. Yet the depth and clean edges suggested an intelligence behind the attack that no wild animal should possess. In all my years, Dr. Voss told the local newspaper, I've never seen anything like this. Wolves kill to eat, but these animals were left completely untouched. No flesh was consumed, no organs removed. It's as if something killed for the pure sake of killing. The most disturbing detail emerged when crime scene investigators, yes, they had called in actual police forensics, examined the scene more thoroughly. Surrounding each dead sheep was a perfect circle of paw prints, each measuring nearly 18 centimeters in length. The prints showed deliberate placement, as if the killer had walked methodically around each victim before striking. The depth of the impressions suggested an animal weighing at least 80 kilograms, yet the prints showed no signs of claws, which ruled out bears or large wildcats. Within 2 weeks, 3 more farms reported similar attacks. The pattern remained consistent: multiple sheep killed but not eaten, precise throat wounds, and those unnaturally large paw prints arranged in perfect circles around each carcass. The local police established a task force, and wildlife experts from Wageningen University were brought in to analyze the evidence. Professor Adrian Klein, the university's leading expert on predator behavior, held a press conference that I watched from my cramped apartment, feeling an inexplicable chill as he spoke. "The behavior we're observing is unprecedented in the scientific literature," he announced, his usually confident demeanor noticeably shaken. "No known predator species exhibits this type of systematic killing without consumption. The precision of the wounds suggests an animal with extraordinary bite force and jaw control, yet the complete absence of feeding behavior contradicts every predatory instinct we understand." The media dubbed it the ghost wolf of Gelderland, though Professor Klein repeatedly insisted that wolves had been extinct in the Netherlands for over a century and a half. DNA samples from the bite wounds proved inconclusive. The saliva contained genetic markers consistent with Canis lupus, yet several sequences didn't match any known wolf subspecies in existing databases. As autumn deepened into winter, the attacks suddenly stopped. No more dead sheep, no more mysterious paw prints, no more terrified farmers calling the police in the pre-dawn hours. The task force was quietly disbanded, the university experts returned to their laboratories, and the local news moved on to other stories. But the farmers didn't forget. They installed motion-activated cameras, reinforced their fencing, and many began keeping loaded rifles by their doors. I followed every news report with an obsession that disturbed even me. Something about the systematic nature of the killings, the intelligence implied by the evidence, resonated with a dark fascination I didn't fully understand. I printed out newspaper articles and pinned them to the wall of my apartment, creating a timeline of events that grew more complex with each passing day. My colleagues at work began commenting on my distracted behavior, my inability to focus on spreadsheets and quarterly reports, when my mind was consumed by thoughts of what might be lurking in the forests I loved so deeply. The official explanation, when it finally came, was disappointingly mundane. A rogue pack of hybrid wolf dogs, the authorities declared, probably abandoned pets that had reverted to wild behavior. The precision of the kills was explained away as learned behavior from their domestic upbringing, and the lack of consumption was attributed to stress and territorial marking. Case closed, files archived, public concerns officially addressed. But I knew better. I had spent too many nights in those forests, felt too deeply connected to their rhythms and secrets, to accept such a sanitized explanation. There was something else out there, something that the authorities either couldn't identify or chose not to acknowledge. And as winter gave way to the promising warmth of early spring 2024, I found myself drawn more and more frequently to the very regions where the attacks had occurred. My supervisor, a perpetually stressed woman named Ingrid, who smelled of stale coffee and unfulfilled dreams, called me into her office on a particularly dreary March afternoon. "Your performance has been declining," she said, not bothering to look up from the evaluation form she was filling out. "Your attention seems to be elsewhere lately. Is everything all right at home?" I wanted to tell her about the nights I spent hiking through forests where something had killed sheep with surgical precision. I wanted to explain how the official explanations felt like lies designed to comfort a public that couldn't handle the truth. Instead, I mumbled something about stress and promised to do better. But even as I spoke, I was already planning my next nocturnal expedition, already feeling the familiar pull of the wild places that had become more real to me than the fluorescent-lit office where I wasted my days. That evening, I spread out detailed topographical maps of the Gelderland region on my kitchen table, marking each location where attacks had been reported. A pattern emerged that the official investigation had apparently missed or chosen to ignore. The kills formed a rough circle approximately 15 kilometers in diameter, centered on a dense section of forest that local hikers rarely visited due to its swampy terrain and poor trail maintenance. I traced the circle with my finger, feeling a strange mixture of fear and anticipation. Whatever had killed those sheep was still out there, still following patterns that only I seemed to recognize. And tomorrow night, I would begin my search for the truth that everyone else was too frightened or too comfortable to pursue. My relationship with the forests began long before the sheep killings, rooted in a childhood trauma that I've never discussed with anyone, not even the therapist my parents forced me to see after the incident. I was 11 years old when my younger brother, Peter, disappeared during a family camping trip in the Hogavelua National Park. We were playing hide-and-seek among the towering pine trees while our parents set up camp, and he simply vanished. The search lasted 4 days, involving hundreds of volunteers, police dogs, and helicopter surveillance. They found his body at the bottom of a ravine, apparently the victim of an accidental fall. But I knew better. I had heard him screaming in the distance, a sound that cut through the forest like a blade through silk, filled with terror beyond anything a simple fall could produce. When I tried to tell the adults about the screams, they dismissed them as my imagination, traumatic stress manifesting as false memories. The official cause of death was accidental drowning. He had fallen into a stream and struck his head on the rocks. From that day forward, the woods called to me with an intensity that bordered on compulsion. I couldn't stay away from them, couldn't resist the pull of the deep forest where shadows moved in ways that defied explanation and sounds carried meanings that civilized people had forgotten how to interpret. My parents worried, of course. They took me to specialists who diagnosed me with everything from PTSD to obsessive-compulsive disorder, but none of their treatments could diminish the magnetic force that drew me into the wilderness. By the time I reached university age, my nocturnal wanderings had become a central part of my identity. I studied forestry management, partly to understand the ecosystems I was so drawn to, but mostly to have legitimate reasons for spending time in remote locations where others feared to tread. My professors noted my unusual ability to navigate in complete darkness, my uncanny skill at identifying animal tracks and behavioral patterns, and my disturbing comfort level in situations that sent other students fleeing back to their dormitories. Dr. Margaretha Zielstra, my wildlife behavior instructor, pulled me aside after a particularly intense field exercise in the Kinderdijk wetlands. "You have an extraordinary connection to the natural world," she said, studying my face with the analytical intensity of someone accustomed to observing predator-prey relationships. "But there's something almost feral about the way you move in the forest. Are you getting enough sleep? Maintaining proper social connections?" I assured her that I was fine, but the truth was more complicated. My nocturnal expeditions had grown longer and more frequent, often lasting entire nights as I explored territories that even experienced rangers avoided. I had developed an ability to move through dense undergrowth without making a sound, to read the subtle signs that indicated predator presence, and to distinguish between the normal sounds of nighttime forest activity and the unnatural silences that preceded danger. The sheep killings changed everything. Suddenly, my obsession had a focus, a specific mystery that demanded investigation. I began carrying detailed journals on my night hikes, documenting every unusual sound, every displaced branch, every scent that didn't belong to the normal ecosystem. My handwriting grew increasingly erratic as I recorded observations that I knew no one else would believe. The way certain areas of forest fell completely silent at specific times of night, the strange patterns of broken branches that formed geometric shapes too precise to be natural, the occasional discovery of animal bones arranged in configurations that suggested intelligence and purpose. My apartment became a shrine to the mystery. Topographical maps covered every wall, marked with colored pins indicating reported sightings, unusual animal behavior, and my own disturbing discoveries. I installed a police scanner to monitor emergency calls from the rural districts, and I kept detailed files on every farmer, ranger, and local resident who had reported unusual incidents. My neighbors began to complain about the smell. I had stopped bathing regularly, finding that human soap and deodorant interfered with my ability to detect the subtle scents that provided crucial information during my forest investigations. Work became increasingly difficult to endure. The fluorescent lights hurt my eyes, which had adapted to function optimally in near total darkness. The constant chatter of my colleagues felt like meaningless noise compared to the rich symphony of forest sounds that had become my preferred language. I found myself snapping at people who interrupted my concentration, becoming aggressive when forced to participate in team meetings or social events that kept me away from my true calling. Ingrid's concerns about my performance were completely justified, though for reasons she couldn't possibly understand. I was no longer fully human in the conventional sense. My senses had sharpened to superhuman levels. My reflexes had adapted to the split-second timing required for survival in predator territory, and my understanding of natural systems had evolved beyond what any textbook could teach. I could identify individual animals by their scent trails, predict weather changes by the behavior of insects, and navigate complex terrain using only the subtle variations in air current and sound reflection that indicated the presence of trees, rocks, and water sources. The transformation wasn't entirely pleasant. Human food began to taste bland and artificial compared to the wild berries and edible plants I had learned to identify during my expeditions. Sleeping indoors felt suffocating. I often found myself opening all the windows in my apartment and lying on the floor, trying to recreate the sensation of sleeping under an open sky. My social relationships deteriorated as I lost interest in conversations that didn't relate to tracking, animal behavior, or forest ecosystems. Dr. Hendrik van Essen, a psychologist my concerned sister convinced me to visit, attempted to diagnose my condition as a form of dissociative disorder. "You're using the forest as an escape from trauma," he explained during our single session together. The nocturnal wandering, the hypervigilance, the social isolation. These are all symptoms of someone trying to avoid processing a deeply painful experience. I wanted to explain that I wasn't escaping into the forest. I was returning to it. The woods weren't a refuge from reality. They were reality, raw and honest and unfiltered by the comfortable lies that civilized society told itself. In the forest, death was immediate and honest. Predators didn't pretend to be anything other than what they were, and prey animals didn't delude themselves about their place in the food chain. It was the only environment where I felt truly alive, truly myself. As spring progressed into summer, my expeditions grew more ambitious. I began exploring territories that had been off-limits even to experienced hikers, penetrating deep into swamplands and dense forest areas where the canopy was so thick that daylight never reached the ground. I discovered animal trails that didn't correspond to any known species migration patterns, finding tracks that measured larger than any animal that should exist in the Dutch ecosystem. The most disturbing discovery came on a humid July night, when I was exploring a particularly remote section of forest near the German border. Hidden beneath a natural overhang created by fallen trees, I found what could only be described as a lair. The ground had been deliberately cleared and shaped into a circular depression approximately 3 meters in diameter. The earth was packed hard and smooth, stained dark with what might have been blood. Arranged around the perimeter were dozens of bones, sheep bones, I realized with growing horror, picked completely clean and organized by size and type with a precision that suggested planning and intelligence. But it was the smell that truly terrified me. The entire area reeked of something that wasn't quite wolf, wasn't quite dog, but contained elements of both along with other scents I couldn't identify. It was the smell of something that didn't belong in any ecosystem I understood, something that existed outside the normal rules of predator and prey. I documented everything with my camera, took detailed measurements, and collected samples of the strange dark soil for later analysis. That night marked a turning point in my obsession. I was no longer simply investigating unusual animal behavior. I was tracking something that challenged every assumption I had about the natural world. And based on the freshness of the scent markers around the lair, something that was very much still active in the region. I made a decision that would have horrified anyone who cared about my well-being. I would begin spending entire nights in the forest, waiting and watching for whatever had created that unnatural sanctuary. My vacation time from work would be dedicated to a systematic surveillance operation that would either provide answers or confirm my growing suspicion that I was dealing with something beyond normal scientific classification. The hunt was about to begin, September 15th, 2024. The date is burned into my memory with the same intensity as a brand on cattle hide. I had been planning this particular expedition for 3 weeks, studying weather patterns, moon phases, and local animal activity reports to optimize my chances of making contact with whatever had killed those sheep. The forecast promised a moonless night with intermittent cloud cover, perfect conditions for something that preferred to hunt in complete darkness. I left my apartment at 6:30 p.m., loading my mountain bike with equipment that would have seemed excessive to any casual observer. Night vision binoculars, motion-detecting cameras, audio recording equipment, and enough food and water to sustain a 3-day surveillance operation. My backpack also contained items that I hoped I wouldn't need: a military-grade flashlight capable of producing 3,000 lumens, a high-pitched whistle designed to disorient aggressive animals, and a folding knife with a 12-centimeter blade that I had practiced drawing in complete darkness until the motion became automatic. The ride to the forest took 45 minutes, following back roads that wound through agricultural districts where farmers had learned to bring their livestock indoors well before sunset. I passed 3 properties where motion-activated floodlights had been installed around sheep pens, their harsh illumination creating pools of artificial daylight in the gathering dusk. Security cameras were mounted on fence posts, their red recording lights blinking like electronic eyes that watched for threats the owners couldn't name. I chained my bike to a utility pole approximately half a kilometer from the forest entrance, in a location that would allow for rapid escape if circumstances required it. The walk to my chosen observation point would take me through increasingly dense vegetation, following animal trails that I had memorized during previous reconnaissance missions. My destination was a natural blind created by fallen trees and dense undergrowth, positioned approximately 200 meters from the area where I had discovered the bone circle 3 months earlier. As I entered the forest, the familiar sensation of heightened awareness flooded my nervous system. My vision adjusted automatically to the minimal light conditions, revealing details that would have been invisible to normal human perception. The texture of bark became tactile information that I could process without touching. The subtle variations in ground consistency told me where to place my feet to avoid making noise, and the complex symphony of insect and small animal activity provided a real-time map of the ecosystem around me. But something was wrong. The normal patterns of forest sound were disrupted in ways that immediately triggered my alarm systems. Sections of woodland that should have been active with nocturnal creatures were completely silent, creating dead zones of unnatural quiet that moved through the landscape like an infection spreading through healthy tissue. I paused frequently to analyze these disturbances, trying to determine whether they indicated the presence of a predator or something more unusual. 20 minutes into my approach, I encountered the first physical evidence that I was not alone in the forest. A sheep carcass, less than 6 hours old based on the temperature of the body and the progression of rigor mortis, lay beside a game trail that I had used countless times during previous expeditions. The kill was identical to those reported in the media. A single devastating bite to the throat, no consumption of flesh, and the distinctive circular arrangement of enormous paw prints around the body. But this kill was different in one crucial detail. The sheep hadn't been part of any local flock. Its ear tags identified it as belonging to a farm more than 20 kilometers away. Something had transported this animal across a significant distance before killing it in this specific location. The implications were staggering. Either I was dealing with a predator intelligent enough to engage in complex hunting strategies, or the creature possessed physical capabilities that defied biological norms. I photographed the scene from multiple angles, documenting the precise placement of the carcass, the pattern of surrounding tracks, and the unusual absence of blood despite the massive throat wound. My hands remained steady as I worked, but my pulse was racing with a combination of terror and exhilaration that I had never experienced before. This was proof that my months of investigation had been justified, evidence that something extraordinary was active in these forests. The scent hit me as I was packing away my camera. Rich, musky, and completely unlike anything in my extensive catalog of forest smells. It contained elements of wet fur and fresh blood, but underneath these familiar components was something else, something that triggered a primal fear response that bypassed rational thought and sent adrenaline flooding through my system. My body prepared for fight or flight before my conscious mind had even processed the threat. I crouched behind the fallen log that concealed my position, controlling my breathing and listening with an intensity that bordered on supernatural. The normal sounds of the forest had ceased entirely, replaced by a silence so complete that it seemed to press against my eardrums like physical weight. Even the insects had stopped their chirping, creating an acoustic vacuum that made my own heartbeat sound like thunder. The footsteps, when they came, were deliberate and measured. Not the random wandering of a lost animal, but the purposeful movement of something that knew exactly where it was going. The spacing between steps suggested an animal much larger than any wolf, yet the sound was wrong for a bear or other large mammal. Each footfall was placed with careful precision, as if the creature was consciously minimizing noise while maintaining forward momentum. I raised my binoculars and scanned the area ahead of me, adjusting the focus to penetrate the deeper shadows between the trees. For several minutes, I saw nothing but the normal landscape of trunks, undergrowth, and fallen branches that created the complex three-dimensional maze of the forest floor. Then, moving with fluid grace that seemed to defy the laws of physics, a shape detached itself from the darkness and began moving directly toward my position. My first thought was that I was observing an unusually large wolf, perhaps a specimen that had wandered south from the expanding populations in Germany or Poland. But as the creature moved closer, details became visible that challenged this initial identification. The proportions were wrong. Too tall, too broad through the chest, with limbs that were longer relative to body size than any wolf I had ever studied. The head was massive, with ears that seemed almost human in their shape and placement. But it was the eyes that shattered any attempt to categorize this animal within normal taxonomic classifications. They reflected the minimal available light, with an intensity that suggested a tapetum lucidum far more developed than that of any terrestrial predator. More disturbing was their apparent focus and intelligence. This wasn't the random environmental scanning of an animal following scent trails. These were the calculated observations of something that was actively hunting. The creature paused approximately 50 meters from my hiding place, raising its head to sample the air with the same methodical approach it applied to its movement. I realized with growing horror that it was tracking my scent, following the chemical trail I had left during my approach to this location. My elaborate concealment was meaningless if the animal could pinpoint my exact position through olfactory analysis. I gripped the handle of my knife, knowing that the weapon would be useless against an animal of this size, but finding comfort in the familiar weight of the blade. My mouth had gone completely dry, and I had to make a conscious effort to prevent my hands from trembling as I continued to observe the creature through my binoculars. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to abandon my equipment and flee back to the safety of civilization, but I forced myself to remain motionless. The creature's head turned in my direction with mechanical precision, and for a moment that seemed to last forever, we stared directly at each other across the darkness. I saw intelligence in those reflective eyes, awareness and calculation that transcended normal animal cognition. This wasn't a wild beast operating on instinct. This was something that understood its environment and its own capabilities with a sophistication that terrified me. Then, without warning, it stood upright. The transformation was fluid and natural, as if the creature possessed a skeletal and muscular system designed for both quadrupedal and bipedal locomotion. Standing erect, it towered at least 2.5 meters tall, its silhouette resembling a grotesque fusion of human and canine anatomy. The arms were longer than they should have been, ending in hands that were clearly capable of manipulating objects with the same dexterity as human fingers. I stopped breathing entirely, afraid that even the sound of my respiration might trigger an attack. The creature stood motionless for what might have been 30 seconds or 3 hours. Time had become meaningless in the face of this encounter. Then, moving with the same deliberate precision it had displayed while walking, it turned and began moving away from my position. But not before pausing to look back at me one final time. Its head tilted at an angle that was unmistakably human in its curiosity and assessment. The rational part of my mind screamed warnings about the stupidity of pursuing a predator that could stand 7 feet tall and had just demonstrated capabilities beyond any known animal species. But rationality had ceased to be a determining factor in my behavior months ago. I waited exactly 10 minutes after the creature disappeared before emerging from my hiding place, using the time to document my observations and formulate a tracking strategy that might allow me to maintain contact without triggering a lethal confrontation. The creature's trail was unlike anything I had encountered during my years of studying wildlife behavior. The paw prints, I still thought of them as paw prints, though they were clearly something more complex, were spaced nearly 2 meters apart when the animal moved at a normal pace. The depth of the impression suggested a weight distribution that was all wrong for a quadruped. Too much pressure on the rear feet, not enough on the front. It was the track pattern of something that was equally comfortable moving on 4 legs or 2. More disturbing were the occasional handprints I found pressed into soft patches of earth. 5 distinct fingers, each ending in what appeared to be a retractable claw with an opposable thumb that could manipulate objects with human-level dexterity. The size was enormous. Each handprint measured nearly 20 centimeters from wrist to fingertip, but the proportions were unmistakably humanoid. I followed the trail for approximately 1 kilometer, moving with exaggerated caution and pausing frequently to listen for sounds that might indicate the creature's presence ahead of me. The track led deeper into the forest, toward areas where the canopy was so dense that even my adapted vision struggled to penetrate the absolute darkness. My flashlight remained unused. Any artificial light would announce my presence to something that clearly possessed superior sensory capabilities. The trail began to reveal behavioral patterns that challenged every assumption I had made about predator psychology. Rather than following the most direct route through the terrain, the creature had chosen a path that kept it concealed from potential aerial observation while simultaneously providing multiple escape routes at every turning point. This wasn't the random wandering of an animal following instinct. This was tactical movement that demonstrated planning and environmental awareness. At several points along the trail, I discovered evidence of deliberate scent marking. The creature had stopped to urinate against specific trees, but not randomly. Each marking was positioned at exactly the same height, approximately 1.5 meters above ground level, and spaced at regular intervals that suggested territorial boundary establishment. The scent was unlike anything in my experience. Powerful, musky, with chemical components that seemed to trigger unconscious fear responses in every mammal I had observed reacting to it. Small animals had fled the area entirely. No rabbit tracks, no evidence of nocturnal rodent activity, no droppings from the deer that normally use these trails for their evening feeding migrations. It was as if the creature's passage had created a biological dead zone that extended for hundreds of meters on either side of its route. Even the insects had gone silent, their normal chorus replaced by an oppressive quiet that made my footsteps sound like gunshots despite my careful movement. After 45 minutes of tracking, I discovered the first indication of where the creature might be heading. A game trail that I had used during previous expeditions intersected the creature's route, and fresh tracks showed that it had paused at this junction for several minutes before continuing in a direction that led toward the densest section of the forest. But these weren't the only tracks at the intersection. Human footprints, approximately size 11 hiking boots, overlapped with the creature's trail. Someone else had been here within the last few hours, following the same route I was now pursuing. The boot prints showed signs of hurried movement, longer strides, deeper heel impressions that indicated running, or at least rapid walking. Whoever had made these tracks had been either pursuing the creature or fleeing from it. I knelt beside the clearest boot print, using my finger to measure the depth and studying the tread pattern with growing unease. The print was fresh enough that moisture was still seeping into the impression from the surrounding soil. Less than 2 hours old, possibly much more recent. The person who had made this track might still be in the forest, might even be close enough to hear me if I called out. But calling out would also announce my presence to whatever they had been tracking. The decision to continue following both trails required every ounce of courage I possessed. I was no longer simply observing an unusual predator. I was entering a situation that involved unknown human actors and potentially life-threatening variables that I couldn't assess or control. My knife felt inadequate, my escape route was becoming more complex with every step deeper into the forest, and my communication equipment was useless in terrain that blocked most radio signals. The combined trail led me through increasingly difficult terrain, dense undergrowth that required crawling to penetrate, swampy areas where the ground was unstable, and every step risked creating noise that would carry for hundreds of meters, and rocky outcroppings that forced me to choose between speed and stealth. My clothing was soaked with perspiration despite the cool night air, and my hands were beginning to shake from the sustained adrenaline response that had been flooding my system for over an hour. Then I smelled smoke, wood smoke, faint but unmistakable, drifting through the forest from somewhere ahead of my position. Someone had built a fire, either deliberately or as the result of an accident that had ignited the tinder-dry undergrowth that covered much of this area. Fire in dense forest was potentially more dangerous than any predator, capable of spreading with explosive speed and trapping anyone caught in its path. But the smoke carried other scents as well. Burning meat, possibly lamb or mutton, with the distinctive aroma of fat rendering in open flame. Someone was cooking food, which suggested a level of confidence and preparation that didn't match the hurried movement indicated by the boot prints. Either the person I was tracking had stopped to eat, or I was approaching a campsite that existed independently of tonight's activities. The possibility that I might encounter other people in this remote location filled me with almost as much dread as the prospect of facing the creature I had been following. Humans who chose to spend time in areas where large predators were active were often individuals whose motivations couldn't be trusted. Poachers, illegal hunters, or worse, people who came to the deep forest to engage in activities that required absolute privacy and no witnesses. I approached the source of the smoke with extreme caution, moving from tree to tree and pausing for several minutes between each advance to listen for voices or other sounds that might indicate human presence. The scent grew stronger as I moved forward, but it was accompanied by something else that made my stomach clench with instinctive revulsion. The smell of fresh blood, much stronger than what would be produced by normal cooking activities. Not the small amount of blood that escaped from properly butchered meat, but the massive quantities that resulted from a recent kill. Something had died very recently and very violently in the area immediately ahead of my position. I found them in a clearing that had been created by fallen trees, probably the result of a storm that had passed through the region several years earlier. The scene that greeted me challenged my ability to process what I was seeing and reconcile it with any normal explanation. A small campfire burned in the center of the clearing, surrounded by carefully arranged stones that indicated experienced outdoor skills. Suspended over the fire on a makeshift spit was what appeared to be a leg of lamb, expertly butchered and prepared for cooking. The meat was fresh enough that blood was still dripping into the flames, creating small flares and the hissing sound that had helped me locate the campsite. But the lamb hadn't been purchased from any butcher shop. 3 sheep carcasses lay arranged around the perimeter of the clearing, each displaying the identical throat wounds that had become the signature of the creature I was tracking. The bodies were positioned with geometric precision, forming a perfect triangle with the campfire at its center. Most of the meat had been removed from the bones with surgical skill, processed into portions that hung from nearby tree branches like a macabre delicatessen. And standing beside the fire, turning the roasting meat with movements that were both human and disturbingly wrong, was the creature I had been following. But it was no longer moving on 4 legs. In the flickering light of the campfire, the true nature of what I was observing became undeniably clear. This wasn't simply an unusually large wolf that could occasionally rear up on its hind legs. This was something that existed in a perpetual state between human and animal, possessing the capabilities of both while belonging fully to neither category. The creature stood approximately 7 feet tall, its body covered in dense fur that ranged from dark brown along the back to lighter tan on the chest and stomach. But the proportions were wrong for any natural animal. The legs were too long, the arms too developed, and the hands, God help me, they were clearly hands, manipulated the makeshift cooking implements with the same dexterity that any experienced outdoorsman might display. Its head was the most disturbing aspect of its anatomy. The skull was elongated like a wolf's, with a pronounced muzzle filled with teeth that reflected the firelight when it opened its mouth to test the temperature of the cooking meat. But the eyes were positioned more forward than any predator's should be, providing the binocular vision necessary for complex tool use and fine manipulation. When it turned its head in my direction, as if sensing my presence despite my concealment, those eyes showed an intelligence that was unmistakably aware and calculating. I remained frozen behind the fallen log that concealed my position, afraid to move or even breathe normally for fear of attracting its attention. My camera was in my backpack, but reaching for it would require movements that might be detected by something with predator-level senses. Instead, I forced myself to memorize every detail of what I was witnessing, knowing that no one would believe my account without photographic evidence, but understanding that attempting to document the scene might result in my death. The creature finished adjusting the meat on its improvised spit and moved with fluid grace to examine the sheep carcasses arranged around the clearing. It paused beside each body, running its hands along the flanks and checking the quality of the remaining meat with the expertise of someone who had been processing animal carcasses for years. This wasn't random scavenging behavior. This was systematic food preparation that demonstrated planning and forethought. But the most terrifying realization came when I observed how it moved through the campsite. Every action was deliberate and purposeful, from banking the fire to maintain an optimal cooking temperature, to checking the wind direction to ensure that smoke wouldn't accumulate in the clearing. This creature understood fire management, food safety, and campsite organization, with a sophistication that required years of experience and learning. It was then that I noticed the human clothing. Arranged neatly beside the fire were hiking boots, cargo pants, and a flannel shirt that would have fit a very large man. The clothes were clean and well-maintained, suggesting regular use rather than items scavenged from a victim. More disturbing was the presence of human tools. A military surplus knife with a blade that could easily process large game, a small hatchet for cutting firewood, and what appeared to be a water purification system for ensuring safe drinking water during extended wilderness stays. The implications were staggering. This wasn't a wild animal that had learned to use human tools. This was something that lived as both human and predator, switching between forms as circumstances required. The systematic killing of sheep wasn't random predation. It was hunting behavior carried out by something that understood human agricultural systems and could plan complex operations that spanned multiple locations. I watched in horrified fascination as the creature completed its meal preparation and settled beside the fire in a sitting position that was eerily human. It used a sharpened stick to test the doneness of the roasting meat, rotating the spit when one side had cooked sufficiently, and even added what appeared to be wild herbs to enhance the flavor. The entire process was conducted with the casual competence of someone who had performed these same actions countless times before. But it was when the creature began to eat that I truly understood the scope of what I was witnessing. It consumed the cooked meat with obvious relish, tearing off portions with its hands and chewing with the appreciation of someone who understood culinary quality. But periodically, it would pause in its meal to gnaw directly on the raw bones of the sheep carcasses, crushing them with jaw strength that could easily crack human skulls. The transition between civilized eating and savage consumption was seamless, as if both behaviors were equally natural aspects of its feeding routine. 20 minutes into its meal, the creature suddenly stopped eating and raised its head to scan the surrounding forest. Its nostrils flared as it sampled the air, and its ears rotated independently to focus on specific sectors of the woodland around the clearing. Something had changed in the environment, some subtle shift in scent or sound that had triggered its alarm systems. I pressed myself closer to the ground, trying to become invisible while maintaining visual contact with the clearing. My heart was beating so hard that I was afraid the sound might be audible to something with supernatural hearing abilities. Every muscle in my body was tense with the anticipation of flight, though I knew that running would be useless against something that could apparently move with equal speed on 2 legs or 4. The creature stood slowly, its movements fluid and controlled despite its obvious state of alertness. It moved to the edge of the clearing and began a systematic examination of the tree line, pausing every few meters to analyze scents and sounds that were beyond my ability to detect. Its head turned in my direction, and for a moment that seemed to last an eternity, those intelligent eyes seemed to stare directly into mine. Then it began walking toward my hiding place. I had perhaps 30 seconds before it would reach the fallen log that concealed my position. My options were limited and all of them terrifying: remain hidden and hope that it would pass by without detecting me, attempt to flee through forest terrain where I would be at a severe disadvantage, or reveal myself and try to communicate with something that might be intelligent enough to understand human speech, but predatory enough to kill me without hesitation. The creature was now close enough that I could hear its breathing, a sound that was deeper and more controlled than any animal's should be. It moved with the careful precision of something that was accustomed to stalking prey, placing each foot to minimize noise while maintaining the ability to spring into attack mode at any moment. The firelight behind it created a silhouette that was the stuff of nightmares, a fusion of human intelligence and predatory capability that violated every natural law I understood. 15 seconds, 10 seconds, 5 seconds. I made a decision that was either the bravest or most foolish of my life. I stood up. The creature stopped immediately, its body language shifting from predatory stalking to surprised assessment. We stared at each other across a distance of less than 3 meters, two species that should never have encountered each other in this way, each trying to determine whether the other represented an immediate threat. "Please," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not here to hurt you or interfere with what you're doing. I just want to understand." The creature tilted its head at an angle that was unmistakably human in its curiosity. Its eyes never left mine, but I could see intelligence working behind them, processing information and formulating responses in ways that transcended normal animal cognition. When it finally spoke, its voice was rough and distorted by vocal cords that weren't designed for human speech. But the words were clear and deliberately chosen. "You have been watching me for months." The sound of human speech from that inhuman throat triggered a primal terror response that bypassed all rational thought. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, to put as much distance as possible between myself and something that should not exist but was standing 3 meters away, speaking in a voice that somehow conveyed both intelligence and barely contained predatory instinct. But I forced myself to remain still, to meet those golden eyes that reflected the firelight like a wild animal's, while carrying an awareness that was disturbingly human. My voice, when I finally managed to speak, came out as a hoarse whisper. "You can talk." The creature's mouth opened in what might have been amusement, revealing teeth that could tear through bone and sinew with effortless efficiency. "I have always been able to talk. The question is why you have been following me with such persistence." Its speech was careful and deliberate, each word chosen with precision as if speaking required conscious effort and concentration. The accent was unmistakably Dutch, with regional inflections that suggested someone who had grown up in the same general area where I lived and worked. This wasn't some exotic predator that had wandered in from distant wilderness. This was something that belonged to the local ecosystem and understood the human communities that surrounded it. "I wanted to understand what was killing the sheep," I said, surprised by my own honesty. The official explanations didn't make sense. The creature moved closer, and I had to fight every instinct to avoid backing away. Its movement was fluid and controlled, but I could see the potential for explosive violence in every line of its muscular frame. When it spoke again, its voice carried a note of what might have been approval. "The officials prefer comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. You are different. You seek truth, even when it frightens you." I gestured toward the sheep carcasses arranged around the clearing. "Why do you kill them like that? Why not just take what you need?" The creature followed my gaze to the systematically butchered animals, then looked back at me with an expression that was difficult to interpret. "I take exactly what I need, no more, no less. The arrangement is aesthetic preference." The casualness with which it discussed its killing methodology sent ice through my veins. This wasn't a wild animal acting on instinct. This was something that made conscious choices about how to conduct its predatory activities. The geometric arrangement of the bodies, the precise throat wounds, the careful selection of victims, all of it was the result of deliberate decision-making by something that understood both efficiency and symbolic meaning. "What are you?" I asked, though I wasn't certain I wanted to hear the answer. The creature was silent for a long moment, studying my face with an intensity that made me feel like a laboratory specimen. When it finally responded, its voice carried undertones of something that might have been sadness. "I am what happens when the line between human and animal becomes meaningless, when the needs of both must be satisfied in the same body." It gestured toward the human clothing beside the fire. "During the day, I work in an office in Utrecht. I attend meetings, complete spreadsheets, participate in the routines that define civilized existence. But when darkness comes, when the moon calls and the forest offers its gifts, I become what I was always meant to be." The revelation struck me with the force of physical blow. This wasn't some mythical creature or genetic anomaly. This was someone who lived a double existence, switching between human civilization and predatory wilderness as casually as changing clothes. The systematic nature of the sheep killings suddenly made perfect sense. Someone with human intelligence planning hunting operations using predatory capabilities that exceeded anything in the natural world. "How many of you are there?" I managed to ask. The creature's expression shifted to something that looked like amusement. "You assume I am part of a group? What makes you think I am not unique?" Before I could formulate a response, the creature's head snapped toward the forest behind me, its nostrils flaring as it detected something that was beyond my sensory capabilities. Its body language shifted instantly from conversational to predatory, every muscle tensing for immediate action. "Someone else is coming," it said, its voice dropping to a growl that contained more animal than human elements. "Someone who means harm to both of us." I turned to look in the direction that had captured its attention, but my inferior senses detected nothing unusual. The forest appeared empty and silent, with no indication of approaching danger. But the creature's reaction was unmistakable. Whatever was approaching represented a threat significant enough to override its apparent willingness to continue our conversation. "You need to leave," the creature said, moving with liquid grace toward the human clothing beside the fire. "Now, before they realize you have seen me." "Who's coming?" I asked. But the creature was already beginning a transformation that defied biological possibility. Its posture shifted from upright to quadrupedal in seconds, its body seeming to compress and reshape itself for maximum speed and agility. The hands that had been manipulating cooking tools became paws capable of gripping terrain and propelling its body through dense undergrowth at incredible velocity. Most disturbing of all, its face elongated and became more wolf-like, though the intelligence in its eyes remained completely intact. "Government hunters," it said, its voice becoming increasingly distorted as its vocal cords adapted to a different configuration. "They have been tracking me for weeks. If they find you here, you will be eliminated as a witness." The casual way it discussed my potential murder focused my attention with terrifying clarity. This was no longer an encounter with an unusual predator. This was a situation involving human authorities who were willing to kill civilians to protect whatever secrets were associated with the creature's existence. "Run!" the creature commanded, its transformation now complete. "Follow the game trail northeast for 2 kilometers, then circle back to your bicycle using the main hiking path. Do not deviate from this route." I wanted to ask a dozen questions, to understand who these government hunters were and why they considered the creature important enough to justify murdering witnesses. But the sound of approaching vehicles, still distant but growing closer, provided all the motivation I needed to abandon my investigation and focus on survival. I turned and ran into the forest, following the creature's directions while my mind struggled to process everything I had witnessed. Behind me, I could hear the systematic destruction of the campsite as the creature eliminated evidence of its human-like activities. The fire was extinguished, the cooking equipment hidden or destroyed, and the sheep carcasses dragged into positions that would suggest normal predatory behavior rather than the calculated butchering I had observed. The game trail was barely visible in the darkness, but my months of nocturnal exploration had trained me to navigate by subtle visual cues that most people would miss entirely. I moved as quickly as stealth would allow, pausing frequently to listen for sounds of pursuit, while trying to maintain the northeast bearing that would eventually lead me back to familiar territory. After 20 minutes of careful movement, I heard the first gunshots. 3 rapid reports from high-powered rifles, followed by shouting voices that carried through the forest, despite the acoustic dampening effect of dense foliage. The voices were speaking Dutch, but with the clipped professional tone of military or law enforcement personnel conducting a coordinated operation. More gunshots, spaced at irregular intervals as if the shooters were tracking a moving target through difficult terrain. I forced myself to continue following the creature's prescribed route, despite every instinct screaming at me to either flee in the opposite direction or return to help something that had shown me unexpected mercy. 20 minutes later, the forest fell silent. I reached my bicycle without encountering any of the government hunters, though I discovered fresh tire tracks from military-style vehicles that had been driven to within a few hundred meters of the forest edge. The operation had been planned and executed with professional efficiency, suggesting resources and authority that went far beyond local law enforcement capabilities. During the ride home, I struggled with the implications of everything I had witnessed. The creature's casual admission that it worked in an office in Utrecht meant that it was integrated into normal human society in ways that made detection almost impossible. Its knowledge of government pursuit suggested that whatever agency was hunting it had been conducting operations for an extended period. Most disturbing of all, its willingness to murder witnesses indicated that the stakes involved were high enough to justify extreme measures. By the time I reached my apartment, one fact had become crystal clear. I was now involved in something that was far more dangerous than I had ever imagined, and there was no possibility of returning to my previous life of simple woodland exploration and amateur investigation. The hunt had found me. The next 3 days passed in a state of hypervigilant tension that left me unable to eat, sleep, or focus on anything beyond the constant expectation of discovery. Every knock on my apartment door, every unexpected phone call, every unmarked vehicle parked on my street became a potential sign that the government hunters had identified me as a witness requiring elimination. I called in sick to work, claiming a severe case of food poisoning that would keep me home for the remainder of the week. Ingrid's irritated response suggested that my job security was becoming precarious, but employment concerns seemed trivial compared to the possibility that armed professionals might be tracking my movements and monitoring my communications. My apartment became a fortress of paranoia. I installed additional locks on the doors, covered the windows with newspapers to prevent surveillance from neighboring buildings, and moved my sleeping area to the bathroom where there were no external windows that could provide sniper angles. My police scanner ran constantly, monitoring emergency frequencies for any reports of unusual activity in the forest regions where I had been conducting my investigations. But it was the local news coverage that truly confirmed the scope of what I had witnessed. On the morning of September 18th, exactly 3 days after my encounter with the creature, the regional television station ran a brief story about a training exercise conducted by an unnamed government agency in the forests near the German border. The report featured carefully edited footage of military vehicles and armed personnel, but provided no details about the nature of the training or the specific agencies involved. More significant was what the report didn't mention. No acknowledgement of the gunshots that had echoed through the forest, no explanation for why a training exercise would require live ammunition, and no discussion of what, if anything, had been the target of the operation. The sanitized, information-free nature of the coverage suggested official control over what details were allowed to reach the public. The local newspaper's coverage was even more revealing in its deliberate vagueness. A single paragraph buried on page 7 mentioned that wildlife management specialists had been conducting routine population surveys in the affected area, with no mention of the military-style vehicles or armed personnel that I had observed. The story concluded with a statement that the surveys had been completed successfully and that normal public access to the forest would resume within a few days. I spent hours analyzing every word of these reports, searching for coded messages or hidden meanings that might reveal the true nature of the operation. The terminology was too carefully chosen, too deliberately non-specific, to be anything other than an official cover story designed to explain away activities that the public couldn't be allowed to understand. My attempts to research the creature's claims about working in Utrecht led to disturbing discoveries about the nature of professional life in the Netherlands. Over 40,000 people commuted daily from the surrounding rural areas to office jobs in the city, making it virtually impossible to identify one individual among such a massive population. More troubling was my realization that someone capable of switching between human and predatory forms could maintain a double existence indefinitely without detection, especially if they possessed the intelligence to carefully manage their hunting activities. The systematic nature of the sheep killings took on new meaning when viewed through this perspective. Rather than random predatory behavior, the killings represented calculated operations designed to satisfy biological needs while minimizing the risk of exposure. The creature had been managing its dual existence with the same professional competence it apparently brought to its office work, balancing the requirements of both identities with careful planning and execution. But my investigation had disrupted this balance, forcing the creature into direct contact with someone who could potentially expose its existence to authorities who were already tracking its activities. My months of amateur detective work had inadvertently triggered a confrontation that could have resulted in both our deaths. On the 4th day after my encounter, I made a decision that required more courage than anything I had done during my years of nocturnal forest exploration. I returned to the woods. The clearing where I had witnessed the creature's campsite showed no evidence that anything unusual had ever occurred there. The fire pit had been completely dismantled, the stones scattered to create the appearance of natural geological formation. The areas where sheep carcasses had been arranged showed no traces of blood or disturbance, suggesting professional-level crime scene cleanup that had eliminated every possible piece of physical evidence. But the most significant discovery came when I examined the tree line around the clearing with the systematic thoroughness that my months of investigation had taught me. Buried beneath a thin layer of leaves and forest debris, I found 3 spent rifle cartridges from high-powered hunting rifles. The brass casings were clean and unmarked, suggesting military or law enforcement ammunition rather than civilian hunting supplies. The placement of the cartridges told a story that chilled me to the bone. They formed a rough triangle around the clearing, indicating that the shooters had positioned themselves to create a kill zone with overlapping fields of fire. This hadn't been a tracking operation or an attempt at capture. This had been an execution squad positioned to eliminate their target with overwhelming firepower. But there was no blood, no drag marks, no indication that their target had been hit or killed during the operation. Either the creature had escaped the trap, or it possessed capabilities that made it effectively immune to conventional weapons. I spent 2 hours searching the surrounding area for additional evidence, following game trails and examining every tree and rock formation for signs of the creature's passage. What I found suggested that the government hunters had been correct about one thing. Their target possessed abilities that transcended normal biological limitations, claw marks on tree trunks at heights that would require superhuman jumping ability. Footprints in soft earth that showed a stride length indicating movement at speeds that should have been impossible for any terrestrial animal. Most disturbing of all, areas where the vegetation had been disturbed in patterns that suggested the creature had been moving through the canopy, traveling from tree to tree at heights where ground-based pursuit would be impossible. The evidence painted a picture of something that could switch between human intelligence and predatory capabilities as circumstances required, adapting its behavior and physical abilities to match the threats it faced. The government hunters weren't simply tracking an unusual animal. They were pursuing something that could outthink them, outmaneuver them, and disappear into environments where their technology and training provided no advantages. As I prepared to leave the forest and return to the illusion of safety that my apartment provided, I discovered one final piece of evidence that confirmed my worst fears about the scope of the situation I had become involved in. A small piece of paper, folded and wedged into the bark of a tree at exactly eye level for someone of my height. Inside, written in precise handwriting that could have belonged to any office worker in Utrecht, was a message that made my hands shake as I read it. They know about you now. Change your patterns, vary your routines, and trust no one in official positions. We may need to help each other survive what is coming. 6 months have passed since that night in the forest, and I am no longer the same person who began this investigation with the naive assumption that truth-seeking was a harmless intellectual exercise. The knowledge I have gained has transformed me in ways that go far beyond simple education. It has fundamentally altered my understanding of reality and my place within a world that operates according to rules far more complex and dangerous than I had ever imagined. My life has become a carefully orchestrated performance designed to create the appearance of normalcy while concealing the truth that I am living under constant surveillance by forces that consider my continued existence a potential threat to national security. Every conversation is monitored, every movement tracked, every relationship analyzed for signs that I might be sharing information that could compromise operations I am not supposed to know exist. The transformation began with small changes that seemed insignificant until their cumulative effect became undeniable. My work performance, already deteriorating due to my nocturnal investigations, collapsed entirely as I struggled to concentrate on spreadsheets and quarterly reports while knowing that something capable of switching between human and predatory forms was sitting in an office somewhere in Utrecht, participating in the same mundane routines that had once defined my own existence. Ingrid called me into her office on a gray Tuesday morning in November, her expression carrying the satisfied look of someone who had been anticipating this moment for months. "Your productivity has declined to unacceptable levels," she announced, sliding a termination letter across her desk with barely concealed relief. "We're letting you go, effective immediately." I signed the paperwork without protest, knowing that unemployment would actually make surveillance of my activities more difficult for whoever was monitoring my daily routines. The loss of income was manageable. I had been living frugally for years, and my expenses were minimal compared to the value of maintaining operational security in an environment where a single mistake could result in my permanent disappearance. My apartment became a research facility dedicated to understanding the scope and nature of the forces that I had inadvertently discovered. Using techniques learned from conspiracy theory websites and counterintelligence manuals available online, I swept for listening devices and found 3 professionally installed bugs in locations that would capture conversations throughout my living space. Rather than removing them, I began feeding false information through carefully staged phone calls and conversations with imaginary visitors. The official surveillance was clumsy and obvious, suggesting either overconfidence or a deliberate strategy designed to make me aware of their presence. Unmarked vehicles parked outside my building for extended periods, the same individuals appearing in coffee shops and grocery stores where I conducted my daily business, and phone calls that featured suspicious delays and background noise indicating third-party monitoring. But the creature's surveillance was far more sophisticated. Items in my apartment were moved by millimeters, rearranged in ways that would be undetectable to official observers, but clearly visible to someone who knew exactly how everything had been positioned before leaving. Food disappeared from my refrigerator in quantities too small to represent normal consumption, but precise enough to indicate deliberate sampling. Most unnervingly, I would occasionally detect scents that didn't belong to my normal environment. The same musky, wild odor that I had encountered during our meeting in the forest. The message became clear. I was being protected by something that could enter my apartment at will, monitor my activities with supernatural precision, and eliminate any threats to my safety before I became aware of their existence. The government hunters might be watching my building, but they would never reach my apartment while the creature considered me an asset worth preserving. Communication between us developed through a system of coded messages that exploited the very surveillance network that was supposed to prevent unauthorized contact. Library books would be returned to shelves with specific pages marked, indicating meeting times and locations. Graffiti would appear on walls along my regular walking routes, providing updates on the status of the hunting operations and warnings about areas that had become too dangerous for civilian access. The most detailed information came through newspaper clippings that appeared in my mailbox, articles from regional publications that reported on events that seemed unrelated until viewed through the lens of knowledge that I possessed about the true nature of the situation. Stories about unexplained livestock deaths, reports of unusual wildlife behavior, and brief mentions of government research projects that provided fragments of a larger picture. The scope of the hunting operations was far more extensive than I had initially understood. At least 7 different agencies were involved in tracking and elimination efforts that spanned multiple countries across Northern Europe. The creature I had encountered was not unique. It was part of a population that had been carefully monitored and systematically reduced through operations that were never acknowledged in official records. But the hunters were not winning. Reports filtered through the coded communication system indicating that their targets possessed adaptive capabilities that rendered traditional tracking and elimination methods increasingly ineffective. Creatures that had survived initial assassination attempts became more difficult to locate and more dangerous to pursue. Some had begun working together, sharing information and coordinating activities in ways that suggested organizational capabilities beyond what their hunters had anticipated. The most disturbing revelation came through a newspaper clipping about a training accident at a military facility in Germany. 3 soldiers had been killed during a classified exercise, their bodies found in a condition that suggested attack by large predators. The official explanation blamed equipment malfunction and poor safety protocols, but the creature's marginalia noted that the soldiers had been part of a specialized hunting unit that had been tracking its activities for over a year. The war was escalating, and I was caught in the middle with knowledge that made me valuable to both sides while ensuring that neither could afford to let me live if the conflict reached a decisive phase. My response was to become someone that neither side could predict or control. I moved out of my apartment using cash transactions and false identities to rent a series of short-term accommodations that made surveillance difficult to maintain. I varied my daily routines according to random patterns that prevented the establishment of trackable behaviors. Most importantly, I began documenting everything I had learned about the situation, creating multiple copies of my account that were hidden in locations that would ensure eventual disclosure if I disappeared. This document represents my insurance policy against elimination by forces that prefer to operate in secrecy. It contains enough specific information to compromise hunting operations while revealing the existence of capabilities that governments have been desperately trying to keep classified. Neither the official hunters nor their targets can afford to let this information become public, which means that my survival depends on maintaining a delicate balance that keeps both sides invested in my continued silence. But I am no longer content to remain a passive observer of events that will determine the future relationship between human civilization and forces that exist outside our normal understanding of the natural world. The creature was right when it observed that I seek truth even when it frightens me. The truth I have discovered is that we share our world with intelligence that operates according to different rules, and the attempts to suppress or eliminate that intelligence may be creating conditions for a conflict that could destroy the comfortable illusions that define modern society. I write this account not as a warning, but as preparation for a future where the boundaries between human and animal, between civilized and wild, between possible and impossible, will be redrawn by forces that we are only beginning to understand. The sheep killings were never random acts of predation. They were messages intended for those wise enough to recognize that something new was announcing its presence in our world. The hunt continues, but the roles of predator and prey are no longer as clear as they once seemed. And in the forests of the Dutch-German border, where ancient shadows move between the trees, and modern surveillance technology fails to penetrate the deepest wilderness, the future is being written by intelligence that humanity has not yet learned to recognize or respect. I am no longer simply a witness to these events. I have become a participant in a story that will determine whether our species has the wisdom to adapt to a world far more complex and dangerous than we ever imagined, or whether our insistence on maintaining comfortable lives will lead us into a conflict that we cannot possibly win. The choice, as always, belongs to those brave enough to seek truth, regardless of the consequences. The woods are waiting,